Yes, we can.
A warm welcome to all of you who are joining us from around the world. Assalamu alaikum from Doha. My name is Asma Al Fadala and I'm the Director of Research at WISE. WISE is an initiative of Qatar Foundation, and we are proud to host this online convening in close partnership with Salzburg Global Seminar. This is our first global public convening of 2021, and we are building off of our successful series and subsequent ebook Education Disrupted, Education Reimagined that we hosted throughout 2020. For most of us, the year 2020 will be remembered as one of both disruption and alarm. And for educators, leaders, parents, and students, it will also be remembered as the year that sparked the greatest education crisis in living memory. For most of the year, and is still continuing in some places, global physical lockdown has put an unexpected pause to regular and school learning. In the face of a crisis, school and system leaders, as well as teachers, parents, and students had to quickly develop and implement rapid response schemes at a pace and scale never seen before to help children learn remotely. And as the dust begins to settle on one of the bleakest years in a generation, and schools around the world cautiously navigate reopening, many are wondering what changes, if any, the COVID 19 crisis will leave on learners, schools, and education systems as a whole. In the midst of this crisis, also important and necessary conversations were also had at a global level regarding the challenges within systems themselves. And here at WISE, through our 2020 convening series in partnership with Salzburg Global, we were privileged to play host to many of those discussions. Key themes that emerged from these discussions included the inherent inequality in our education systems and approaches to learning, the need to humanize our education approaches and recognize that learning is a deeply connected collaborative, and the need to prioritize key competencies such as social emotional learning and well-being in the quest to create resilient and future thriving learning environments. These conversations struck at the very core of education itself, inspiring deep and necessary reflection on the part of education stakeholders at all levels on the purpose and values that lie at the heart of schooling. As we enter this new year and begin to emerge from a crisis into what I hope will be a season of renewal, it is my conviction that the time for action is here and now. We know what the problems are, and now we need solutions. As a researcher who focuses on educational leadership, it is my belief that it is leadership, and more specifically, leadership for justice and for transformation. And this is the key to change. Even before COVID, as an education community, we debated and grappled with this idea of 21st century learning and what the future of schooling could and would look like. But now the future is here and the time is to act. Of course, people and governments are capable of great achievements in leadership, in innovation, and in humanity. And as we mentioned in the morning session, we came together this year to defy history and science to create an effective vaccine against COVID 19 at unprecedented speed. Now, the world is also in need of the same urgency, economic commitment, and political will to build back better our education systems to ensure a brighter future for the learners of today and tomorrow. And just to link this point to the earlier discussion from the morning session, one emergent and important theme that came out of our discussion and hopefully will continue throughout our conversation this evening is that perhaps now is the time that the leadership of the previous era be ceded to this new generation, that the youth are indeed our solution for a redesigning and reimagining education. In closing, as I think about this generation of students as both a mother and as an educator myself, my heart breaks at the thought of a generation of lost potential. We owe it to our kids and to our world to reflect on the mistakes of the past and course correct toward a better future. Now it's my pleasure to hand over the virtual mic to my colleague Dominic Registar from Salzburg Global Seminar, who will walk you through the structure and the themes of today's proceedings. Thank you and enjoy the session.
Thank you, Dr. Asma. It's exciting to be back in the rhythm of Education Reimagined. Of course, one of the significant advantages of online events is the greater opportunity for participation that they create and the chance that they offer to engage with many, many more people than we could ever reach with an in-person conference like this. As Dr. Asma said, this is really a continuation of a series that we started last year, and the 3 online conferences in the Education Disrupted, Education Reimagined series in 2020 and the ebook launch that we organized during the UN General Assembly had a total audience of around 20,000. The ebook that so many of the speakers in last year's series contributed to has been downloaded more than 14,000 times. So we know that this topic resonates with a global audience. Across the 2020 series, and this is really clear in the ebook as well, there were 2 very dominant themes. One was around the importance of social and emotional learning in many of the responses to the crisis last year. And then there was a common thread of the importance of outstanding leadership. And we really wanted to run with the leadership idea in the series this year. So with all that in mind, it gives me great pleasure to add my welcome to all of you who are joining today's event live or who are watching on demand at a later point. My name's Dominic Register, and I'm a program director at Salzburg Global Seminar. We're an independent, not-for-profit organization founded in 1947 and based in Salzburg in Austria. Our core mission is to challenge current and future leaders to shape a better world. And that feels particularly topical and timely in the current context, but also specifically for today's program. And as Dr. Asma said, we've been proud partners with WISE since the beginning of the Education Disrupted, Education Reimagined series. So today's event is called Education Reimagined Leadership for a New Era. The structure will follow the model that we used last year. So across today, there'll be 2 sessions that explore the same themes, but with speakers from different parts of the world. And this is the second session today and will last for about 3.5 hours. The structure for this afternoon, if you're in Europe or the Middle East, will be a keynote speaker, the excellent Michael Fullen, and Michael will then be followed by 3 panel discussions, which will cover 3 interconnected topics. The first panel will look at changemaker leadership for a new era. The second panel will look at leading to bridge the equity chasm, and the third panel will focus on amplifying next generation voices in leading learning. We looked at these topics in the first session earlier today as well, and it was really interesting to hear how the different panels developed their ideas and how the conversations evolved. All of the recordings from this morning's session will be on WISE's YouTube channel shortly. If I had to summarize this morning, I think it would really be around the idea that future-ready leadership skills coalesce around certain themes of adaptability, resilience, and responsiveness. And one of this morning's speakers made the excellent point that in many ways, these are exactly the same types of skills that lots of us are trying to help students develop. So we're circling back on the twin themes of last year around social and emotional learning and leadership as being absolutely critical. Throughout all of the sessions this afternoon, please use the chat function in Zoom to share where you're joining from. Use it to share research or articles that you found that are pertinent to the discussion or that you find particularly interesting. Please post questions and comments for the panelists in the chat function. We'll be sharing links throughout the day that are relevant to what they're saying or references that they make. Each of the different moderators also has a team of people working with them to monitor the chat. So we'll try and bring in key themes that you're all surfacing when we get to the Q&A part of each panel discussion. one of our mantras in all of the programs that we do in Salzburg is to try and be tough on the issues, but kind on each other. So if someone says something or posts something that you vehemently disagree with, then please feel free to engage with it, but keep in mind the kind on each other part of the mantra. Last year, one of the things that I read that really stayed with me as we did all of this online convening was a blog about active listening. And it included a brilliant definition of active listening taken from immersive theatre practice, where it said, go into the conversation with the intention of being changed by what will be said. We're going to hear from some amazing speakers and thinkers over the course of the next few hours, and we can all come out of this shared experience thinking a little bit differently about how we might contribute to education. If you're on social media and would like to share insights or anything that you hear, then please tag @WiseTweets and @Salzburg Global in your tweets. And we're using the hashtags SGSEdu, WiseAllIn, and EdLeaders. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce someone that many of us have learned a huge amount from over the years, someone who's been at the cutting edge of education insight and reform, and is also one of the finest moderators that I've ever had the pleasure of seeing in action. So handing the mic to Tony Mackay, who's going to lead us through the first keynote and then the first panel discussion. Tony, over to you.
Dominic, thank you very much. And Asma as well. Well, colleagues, as I just asked for the whole screen to come back so we can see each other, welcome Michael Fullen, colleague and friend. And Michael, I'm not too sure whether I should describe you as researcher, author, activist. I guess you probably don't mind global thought leader, do you?
That's okay with me, for starters.
And people will know, of course, that Michael has been synonymous with exactly what Asma and Dominic have been referring to, namely our commitment to imagine a different future for education and education systems. And indeed, as we, Michael, are going to focus on today, leadership for a new era. In fact, you've just recently published a new paper called The Right Drivers for Whole System Success, which I know is going to be made available to all those who are participating today. But it's great to have you with us and to frame today's session around imagining a different learning system and the kind of leadership that's going to be required if we're going to be successful in ensuring that all young people are able to thrive in a sustainable future. Michael, you also lead, of course, New Pedagogies for Deep Learning, which itself is a global partnership involving many countries, both North and South geographies. So we're absolutely delighted that you're going to launch us into this conversation today. So over to you, and then of course I'll ask you to join the panel. But before that, if we have a few minutes, there'll be some chat and a couple of questions that I might just ensure that we cover before we move to the panel session itself. So again, Michael, welcome.
Thank you very much, Tony. It's an honor to really help kick off this part of the program. I see our collective work, that is the work that's being displayed, for example, today and tomorrow, as hitting the front page right at the beginning of hope rising. That's how I think of it. And this will stimulate hope to go even further. And I think it's big hope. It's about the whole system, but very practically speaking. So I'm going to share a few slides with you. These will be available. And I just want to structure the conversation around that theme I just meant causing hope to rise when it wants to rise, when it's ready to rise. So let's look at the combination of things, a few things I want to do to set up. We know these first two slides, why is change needed, but I want to give you a image. I've come recently, and I did this in a report, to use nicknames for some of the adverbs. And so you can see these four themes that are conspiring, downward spiral. They've been on the move for probably decades, but they've concentrated in the last few years. a fantastic negative pressure. This is the other side of it, the school system, badly outdated. Those are some of the themes that we have moved from. That is to say, this is the problem. What is education going to do about it? I've also framed it this way. Education stalled is really December 2019 and back for really 40 years. Stalled is a kind word in one ways. It's not to blame the people in the public education system. It's just the system was geared for something else and has been long outdated. That in the interim now, in the last 12 months, we see this as you can see it in some ways as an emptying period or an empty period, but the pent up ideas, and I say good or bad because some people can take off in innovations that are going to be actually worse for us. So we're working on the good agenda. I call it the battle of the decade. I think it is, and you'll hear me later compare it to the moonshot. It is about a decade we have of changing the direction of this. So here again, more bad news. We all know this, but I want to secure it as a point that certain things in society for the last at least 40 years, but more, have led to disproportionate failure, very high percentages actually, and limited social mobility. That in this, it's becoming also clear that we all lose. In the report that I'll share with you, I've got the evidence, that is the empirical work, that this is about the combination of things you see on the screen. I like the phrase wounded winners also, which was used in one of the books that I reviewed, which said that those people that appear to be winning, that is, they get good education, they go to a good university, etc., they have the signs of anxiety and problems are just as evident in different ways for them. So we have all kinds of hardly anybody's winning, I guess, is the best way to put it. I put it another way, this way to frame it. Jal Mehta from Harvard and Amanda Datnow from in California, University of San Diego. They've been working on deep learning as well as we have been, and they have. We did a special issue of the American Journal of Education, AJE, where the evidence was when you called for research papers that were moving forward, you didn't find much moving forward. So we can look at that. I want to say a little bit about new pedagogies for deep learning. This is how we frame it. This is how some of you also are framing it. We started this around 2013, I guess. Dominic Register actually is one of the founding discussions of this. This is where, and I'm going to go beyond our deep learning into the wider picture, but this is how I want to set it up. We have these two themes came out of our work in the last 8 years. They came from the bottom in some ways. They came from students especially and teachers. Engage the world, change the world. Engage the world to learn about it, change the world because it needs it. And then you see these combinations. We also have, I'll say these are their core qualities. We have about 10 people on our main team. Joanne Quinn is a co-director. We have a neuroscientist, fabulous contribution, Dr. Jean Clinton. And these are kind of the 5 identities, I guess I'll say, in the process of becoming and the outcome of being. We have, as some of you know, incorporated this in this model. This model is built from the ground up. It has only 13 components. The 6 C's we'll see in a moment in the center, the pedagogical design, the learning design, those 4, second layer. And then the 3 conditions is really the infrastructure at the local and macro level. We have built it around these 6 C's. These are not the normal 21st century skills. We have gone deep and operationalized them and have measures of them, have pedagogies that cause them to come alive. So that's what I'm not going to talk about, which is our part. I want to introduce to you a framework that is bigger, that surrounds this, that provides a bigger agenda. And it is in the context of changing our paradigm, changing the model. Thomas Kuhn, many of you know, 1962, he said there are paradigms that need changing and 2 things are required. One is that the existing paradigm is, he used the phrase, cataclysmic calamity of what is happening with that model. That is the case, but he said that's not enough. We have to have an alternative model. So I see our agenda, Tony and others, about creating this new model. This is the report that Tony referred to. It comes from the Center for Strategic Education. Tony and I guess I'll say, teamed up to do the first report, 2011, on choosing the wrong drivers. This is a much more serious, in-depth report. And I want to really be clear about this because this fits the proactive agenda. This is not a solution in 35 pages. This is not a blueprint. It's an invitation to crowdsource the ideas. And you'll see there are 4 main drivers and 4 corresponding not so good drivers. They can be companions, but not in the driver's seat. And it does require leadership. I'm going to give you, I just promise now, a single slide later, in 5 minutes from now, that will give you the answer to leadership. So stay tuned for that single slide. But this is what I see. We can take any one of the 4 quadrants here. These are the 4 on the left that are what I call the human paradigm, the right drivers. And these 4, you can work on any one without the others, I guess I'll say. We always want to connect them, but let's take equality investments. You'll see when I get to this, there's now a group of very high-powered women economists, a handful of them, that have completely turned the analysis of economic development on its head and are now working on changing that driver, which is one of the 4 drivers, so that you can piecemeal this out and then put it together afterwards. The bloodless paradigm, because there's no humanity in there, I won't have as much time to dwell on the analysis. These are not things that should be thrown out. These are things that should be repositioned, that they can play a role, but they shouldn't be in the dominant role. So you can see that. I think of the drivers this way, that the right drivers, here are my nicknames for them. You'll see them: essence, limitless, dignity, wholeness. The overall strategy: cause the right drivers to rise and dampen the wrong drivers, not eliminate them. Academics obviously are very good. Technology can be very good. So it's not just that. So I won't be able to go into the internal analysis much, but I want to give you a flavor of each of the 4. These drivers that are the wrong drivers, so to speak. This is a list. There's 7 of them. You can look at it in the report. I'd rather come to the main conclusion, but this is what's happening to cause the system to be stuck and in reverse. On the other side, the core part, well-being and learning. This is the big driver. All of us have, I think, are committed to replacing the focus and the leverage and the activity. This is where the solution lies on the first driver, and this is what we've developed in a lot of our work. If you take the second driver, social intelligence over machine intelligence, interesting way of putting it. We now have the evidence, really good studies, that in those first 60 years, the last century, education did race ahead of Claudia Golden was the lead author of that analysis, very clear. And then it changed in the late 70s. And now I think the interesting question, as I posed it, have we overestimated machines and underestimated ourselves, which is a very good way of putting it. So the rise of social intelligence, I could have used collaboration, and I mean, when we talk about fleshing this out, this is not collaborative cultures in the way we've been using it the last 40 years. This is repositioning and thinking of deep social intelligence, individuals and groups working together. The third big driver, equality investments and austerity. This is the one I told you about in terms of the women economists that we'll see Marianne Mazzucato soon in terms of what she's doing, which is really incredibly positioned right now for this agenda. This is the widening for 40 years, deeper and deeper and deeper, the gap of money going to the small percentage at the top and loss going to the other 95% or more. So this is, I call it equality investments. You could call it equity investments, but I mean it as outcomes. A lot of them are investing in the right parts of the infrastructure. They actually produce more wealth, net wealth, by doing it this way. And we still, the bottom point here, we still have to invest in the short-term individual and group equity programs, but these individualistic programs, which have been prominent in policy and investment for 40 years, have really not had much of an impact. So the first three of the four, I think of, just to remind you, we want to synergize them, work on each of them individually, but also in combination of those coming together. So this is very important to think of those as how do we, when you invest in one, you laterally kind of cause the other one to move forward. The last one is the mega one. It's not abstract, it's systemness, I call it, versus fragmentation. We all know about fragmentation, but we don't know as much about systemness. And here's where I want to give you a definition. It's not a real word, I guess, in English, systemness, but it's a real concept. And what it is a subjective state. It's not systemic in the way that complexity theorists just analyze it. It's individuals beginning to look at this and think of themselves as I'm part of a system, and then act accordingly across the three levels that we tend to look at. We also think the sign is good. This is back to I guess a nod to Kuhn, that systems change when this has happened. These are the indicators of a social movement. I promised you a slide that will answer the leadership problem, and here it is. Where's leadership? There it is. Now you can find it. This, of course, is for some of us, at least in 1967, I think this started. In UK, it was called Where's Wally? Find Wally in the picture. You see a picture of Wally, was a cartoon character. When it moved to the US, it became Where's Waldo? So where's leadership? That's where it is everywhere. But I want to give you a little more, as I end here, a little more practical outline here. This is about leadership. This is kind of a mixture of our thinking and certainly consistent with Peter Senge, who we were just interacting with last week. Leadership is for all of us. That's the kind of major part. In fact, more leadership, as we know, can come from the bottom and the middle than from the top, but all three are implicated. It's always relational, building and participating networks of collaboration that bring about change in thinking and doing. Legacy, how many leaders you leave behind. Contextual knowledge, the big thing in nuance was those leaders who were effective had contextual literacy. They not only understood the context, but they got inside it. And there's a whole bunch of things on this page. It's compatible with this conference, so I look forward to the panel. This is the essence of leadership system leadership for me. And then finally, I want to I mentioned Mazzucato, who wrote the great analysis 2 or 3 years ago that got us into thinking of wealth creation differently, where it's more distributed, where it's fundamentally leading towards prosperity or development, and where it treats austerity not as a good thing even to save money, but it's something that even, especially in those times, you have to invest. Her book that just came out last month is called Mission Economy. She calls it a moonshot, and it's a great analysis. It's a great image because this is why I call it the battle of the decade. A moonshot is less than a decade. The next 8 years, critical. And these 5 are her leadership capacities that she talks about that will be necessary. That the good thing about this, and you can read them as well as I could. The good thing about this is she's developing them through initiatives that are very deep and very powerful and very big. Moonshot quality and scope, and it's in depth and it's practical and it involves all kinds of people. My main message is to be able to build up the participation, and what I invite people to do is join us and others, and we'll join you to focus on each of the 4 drivers and then 4 of them in combination. So I look forward to the panel, to your action right now. If we have a couple of minutes, Tony, I've tried to do it that way, where we have 10 minutes for initial Q&A, but this is an agenda, as I said, that not only in these 2 days, but I very much look forward to linking with all of you as we go forward from today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. That's a fantastic opening. And let me ask you just to bring us back on screen, if you could close what you are sharing, and we can...
Yep, we're doing that.
Yep, that's great. And I'll see if we can get a gallery view back, would be great. So Michael, just as you say, before I introduce the panel, or in fact, ask panel members to introduce themselves in a moment, Let me just be clear, because there are a couple of questions coming through here on the chat, which refer to your decisive decade, and what you've just referred to in the terms of a moonshot. Do you feel, as you said at the beginning, that there is a turning point that you're observing from, I am assuming, activity on the ground? You talked about hope. We've just come off a period in which it was pretty hard to be hopeful at certain times. So just, can you say a word about why you believe that hope is on the rise? What are you seeing that gives you some measure of confidence about that? And a number of people are saying a decade. We've had a dominant system for decades, plural, and you're suggesting that we will be able to accelerate our way through the system change of the order that you're referring to in a decade. So what gives you hope, and why are you optimistic about being able to achieve the kind of change you're talking about in a decade?
Just to underscore this is not a pipe dream I'm talking about, just to reinforce what your point is. This is not just pie in the sky stuff. This is, you're right, it's at least 40 years. We go more than that, but we take 1980 as also another negative turning point. 40 years of deeper and deeper reverse of humanity, basically, until it reaches, I wouldn't say it is a crisis point, but that sometimes, and Kuhn said this, it's not enough just to have a crisis. You have to mobilize, and the system has to mobilize. And so to answer your question directly, we see qualitatively different. I think COVID helped in this way. It helped clear the deck a little bit. It helped expose this. It brought out hope from the cracks. And hope, I've changed my mind about hope. I used to say it's not a strategy, but now what we call learned hope, experienced hopefulness, is those people that are already starting down the path and getting experience. They're in this conference these 2 days. It's a critical mass. And not only is it a critical mass, potentially, they are becoming more and more convinced that it's now or never. This is a desperate move in that sense, but it is a now or never hopefulness upward. And we just have to, we can't think about it as 30 years. It's 10 years seems like a really good decade. The 20s seems like another good decade, a century later. So this is the time to go for it. There's no question. And we have to get beyond our individual projects into the connective projects. We have to get political and we have to get aggressive, but we also have to build it so that the new system helps everyone across the spectrum.
Yeah, this sort of resonates with Asma's opening comment about the time for action is now. Let me just see if I can relate this framing to the framing that was used, and others will get access to this because it's all part of the day that we're sharing both sessions. You know Tracy Burns from OECD, and you know the scenarios that have just been published. So when I take your drivers and I think about the scenario work that we were sharing today, do your drivers come together in a way that redesigns the system with clear preferences? Because there are other scenarios that may be less hopeful. So what's your sense of how you marry your own thinking about drivers that can create a new powerful system and the kind of discussion and dialogue, the discourse that's going on around multiple potential futures?
I'm going to mute you the host. I'm going to log off, okay?
Okay. So on your question, Tony, I think I said at the outset that I meant this as the agenda, the 4 drivers, and not that there's somebody would implement all 4 of them simultaneously.
Right.
I think you could take any one of them as long as you start connecting, but go in depth in any one. So I think anything else is, it's too piecemeal for me. So I wanted to set out the big 4 and then say that this is the very agenda, but you don't have to get thoroughly involved in each of them, but you have to have in mind each of these domains. And this is where I think all of these solutions still, like all this emphasis recently on SEL, if that's not grounded in a unified model, it'll be another option of the week, SEL. So, so we are steeped in SEL, but it's got to be a unified model. And finally, moonshot-like thinking. The moonshot, they didn't have the plan on month one. The plan was created through adaptability. Dominic mentioned this, through adaptability, through ingenuity, through all kinds of innovations that were disconnected at the beginning. And then the better ones that provided synergy were brought together cumulatively because they were developing the solution as they went. And the solution was in the 8th year, not in the 2nd year, the big solution.
Got it. Okay, let me just ask you one other, because there's a bit of a chat going on here that I think picks up on the way in which our panel will get into the leadership question, and we've framed it as being change maker leadership, but that's to be explored. But as you know, and as Asma made clear in the opening remarks, we're going to be picking up on the equity challenge, and also we're going to pick up on the next generation. And Asma was arguing in her opening remarks that it is time for us to ensure that that generation will be the designers of solutions that will be powerful. So let me just get you to comment on this, because people are asking a couple of questions here. One, you have positioned equality investments at the heart of your argument. And I'm just wanting to make sure that we're clear about how you are conceiving of that. It's not the way in which I think we've heard others talk about the equity debate. So I just want you to underscore that, if you can, Michael, to help us. And the other is, you often refer to young people as being equal bundles of anxiety and absolute passion to change the world. So the question is, how will young people actually be in the driving seat, right, as we think about the redesign of the system?
Well, let me first say that the investment in equity over the last 40 years has been considerable and has made no difference on, I mean, it has for individuals here and there, but no difference on the kind of outcomes we're talking about. So whatever it is, it's the wrong way of going about it. Absolutely proven decade after decade. So we're talking about a new investment. On the young, I say it this way also, we haven't met a student young enough who doesn't want to be a change agent. They're just the endless combination of solutions is really immobilizing that. We call it contribution to the world, that kind of sense they have. And people, I think when young people look in the mirror today, they see the future and the present as merged. They don't see the future as the future. They say, I'm staring at my own abyss in one sense. So I think that the immediacy of it and the way that young people can get at it, and I do think it's the young and the old also combining to do this. But I think we have to leverage and develop and invest in and have it, but it needs to be a coordinated effort, a la moonshot. It's need to be coordinated in the way that, because we've had pockets of success, radical, great ones, but they don't amount to anything. And now the key question is, what do we do so that these things will connect, amount to something, and get stronger, and then get the breakthrough I'm talking about?
Brilliant. Well, at that moment, Michael, I'm going to invite you to join our panel. Adenike, could I ask you to come on? Oh, perfect. Thank you very much. Just to come on screen. And colleagues, you can see that we've got a fantastic panel. And I'm just going to go back to the panel itself. So if I can go back to the main screen and ask each of you if you could just say a word, just so that it allows people, in the way in which you wish to introduce yourselves, to understand your position, the nature of your work, so where you're coming from as we move into a panel session. So literally, I'm asking you to do this in about 30 seconds each. Adenike, could I start with you? Welcome, and just a quick introduction of yourself.
Yeah, hi, thank you, Tony. My name is Adenike. I am a sustainability educator, and I'm also a National Geographic sustainability curriculum developer. I am the director of the Green Institute in Nigeria, and one of our mission is to build the next generation of sustainability leaders through education, advocacy, and innovation. Just to summarize that, we shape entrepreneurs and selfless leaders who are disrupting environmental injustice through innovative action. Thank you.
I think, would you work across age groups, or would you say you have a predisposition to working with young people?
Young people, actually, we have a plethora of programs. So we have the Green Kids Club for, kids between the age of 5 and 10. And then, of course, we work with university students as well as secondary school students. So across all levels.
Fantastic. Thank you. Glenn.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for having me, everyone. My name is Glenn Kantav, and I'm an activist, social entrepreneur, and performance artist. And I'm the founder of Movers and Shakers NYC. We are a New York-based nonprofit that uses augmented reality as a tool to write Black and Brown history into American curricula. And simply put, we take the labor out of learning using the technology of the future to highlight stories that most kids in the United States don't learn about in school.
Brilliant. Thank you. And I take it, is artist, activist, and performer in equal measure, Glenn? How would you, how do you think about the combo?
I would say it depends on the day. It all depends. Like right now, we've been very focused on launching our app, and especially given COVID, there's not a lot of space for outside actions and teach-ins. But when those days change, then we'll be back on the streets as well.
And just say a word about how you mobilize people around agendas. Can you just make it a little clearer for us about how you use the technology in an immersive way?
Yeah, so we've held teach-ins throughout New York City centered upon augmented reality, where we have graphic representations of parts of history that are usually not told, and anyone can take their smartphones in the rallies and see this contextual information pop up in a way that they most likely haven't seen. I can get more into that in the presentation, but that's a pretty high level.
That's fantastic. Well, it may well be that in Michael Fullen's terms, the future is already well and truly here in the way in which you are working yourself. We'll come back to that. Steve Mumby, say a word.
Hi everyone, it's a real privilege to be here today. I have been an educationist all my life. I was a director of education in a group of 80 schools in England for a number of years, and then chief executive of the National College for School Leadership in England, responsible for the leadership development of leaders in 22,000 schools across England. And then I was CEO of Education Development Trust, which is a not-for-profit organization working in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Now I'm self-employed. I get a chance to work with people like Tony and Michael in different parts of the world, and Valerie too. It's a real privilege to join you here today.
That's brilliant. Steve, would you have had a recent book?
Yes, a book out last year called Imperfect Leadership, a book for leaders who know they don't know it all.
I want to come back to that. Okay. Valerie Hannon.
Hi, everybody. I'm Valerie. I'm based in the UK. A bit like Steve, after a long career in conventional education settings, I opted out of all of that, became co-founder of Innovation Unit, which is a social enterprise devoted to transforming societies into thriving societies, and also co-founder of the Global Education Leaders Partnership, which is trying to do the same thing on an international scale. Last 6 or 7 years, I've turned to authorship to try to help make a difference. And I guess what I've been attempting to do really is to address the whole issue of what Michael referred to as a unified model. And that is to say, trying to create a new narrative around what education is for, and then to think about the consequences of what that narrative tells us. And it's my personal view, we'll get into this later, unless we have a completely new narrative, a new story that we tell ourselves about ourselves, we are not going to achieve the changes we need.
And Valerie, you, just so people do have the opportunity of pursuing that, you have, I think, a second volume or a second edition of Thrive.
Yep.
Just emerged, just published?
Yeah, so that's just come out from Cambridge University Press this month. I think it's going into the chat, so if people want to get hold of a copy of that to have a look, it's called, Thrive.
Great.
The new purpose of
Thank you.
schools.
Okay, fantastic. So can we take the framing that Michael has given us, but not feel constrained by that at all? I don't know why I'm saying that to this particular group of people, because Michael, they're not going to be constrained in any way. So, but I want to get their view around, obviously, the focus that is change maker leadership for a new era. But I want to first focus on the new era, because it would be great to have each of you say something about how you see a new era for education. Michael has given us a view of what that new era might be. But it's, I think, the opportunity now to ask each of you to do that in your own way. And then let's see, Michael, how you might connect and respond to what you're hearing. So I'm going to use you in that rapporteur capacity, if you don't mind. So, Glenn, would you start us off? If the challenge is there before you to try and convey to us how you see a new era of education emerging, how do you respond to that? How do you portray that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the same way that any Silicon Valley app focuses on paying attention to users, we need to plug and play with the same approach with education. And right now, the way that the kids are responding to content from our findings is that they're just simply bored with it, because especially while they're at home, they are playing video games, they're on social media, they have all of this competitive content that has nothing to do with education that they'd rather just spend their time on. And so what we need to do is flip the script and understand how we can modify our content to meet the students exactly where they're at. And so at the end of the day, would a student rather play Fortnite or read through a 40-page academic text? And so it's on us as educators to really figure out how to extract the knowledge you would get from a 40-page text and put it in a format that's similar to what you would find on Fortnite or social media, just something that's much more engaging. I'll leave it at that for now.
Can I just do one thing though, just to make a connection here, Glenn, because there's a lot of conversation at the moment about formal and informal education, structured and unstructured. People still have views about in school and out of school, right? That is not what you're talking about, right? To explain to me then how you see the contours of this sort of new era of learning that is not constrained by previous institutions or ways in which we've packaged up content or ways in which we've gone about delivering it. Are you saying, I want you to think about the nature of the learning process, the place of learning completely differently?
So what I'm saying is that, like, regardless of whether it's in a formal institution or
Right.
it's something that's self-directed online learning, the content has to change no matter what. That's the number one thing.
Got it.
Yeah.
Yep, fantastic. And Anika, how would you make a pitch here for what you see as being what we are at least talking about as a new era of education or a new era of learning? How would you try and capture that in your own context?
Yeah, I mean, one of the key challenges in the world today is climate change in this new era. So for me, I think there should be a focus on climate education because we can see, like, there's been a lot of unprecedented wildfires across the United States, locust swarms across East Africa, extraordinary heat in Siberia, and recently they had a winter storm in Houston, Texas. And the impacts of climate change are being felt in every corner of the world. So, and the overall cost of climate change for human well-being and economic is enormous. So as leaders in education, we need to prioritize climate change education, especially for young people. Young people need to be equipped, they need to be enlightened, they need to be empowered to confront the challenges of climate change. And most importantly, we need to accrue to them with the requisite knowledge, skills necessary to thrive in a greener economy, because the future is moving towards low carbon economy. And if we don't do that, then we risk some of this young people being left behind. So my hope for this new era is maybe like 10 years from now, to see a kind of a geometric increase in the number of educated and climate smart, resilient individuals from early childhood to even adult education. And because the reason is that education is the root of every revolution, and education needs to tackle some of the challenges that we're facing right now. And climate crisis is one of them. And the climate revolution has started, but we need to also protect future generation. We need to think about the future, the effects of climate change on the future, and we need to keep that momentum going. And for us to keep that momentum, we need to make climate change education as one of the key priorities as we move into this new era.
And Nick, can I just, let me ask you this question, because I sometimes hear the new era of learning on a continuum from, you know, purposes that talk about educated citizens to climate warriors through to planetary stewards, right? Like, what is the reach of this? How I can hear exactly where you're focusing your attention, but is your ambition that this focus will dramatically change and transform the way we think about, and certainly the purpose of learning and our future? Yep.
Yes, I mean, of course, the environment is where we are, and we have to protect it. And I believe that because the thing about climate education, it talks about sustainability, and it's not just about just education. It's going into the social aspect of education, talking about the environmental aspect of education, and even the economic aspect of education. So by including climate education into our curriculum, then we'll be able to have a more economically viable society, more socially society, and ultimately more environmentally friendly society. So I think in the long run, we achieve sustainable development through that.
Thank you. Okay, Steve, can you give us your vision for a new era for learning, for education?
Well, I won't give you a vision, Tony, but I will say, first of all, I find Michael's analysis compelling. I love it. But I want to focus just on the pandemic. And I think in terms of the pandemic, I think Asma's right, it's been a catastrophe. There's lots and lots of damage as a result in terms of all kinds of things. There's been some positives too, around parental engagement, around people valuing what schools do even more, around more confident use of technology, around throwing up different ideas for assessment because examinations have not been happening. So there's been some positives. But the way I see it is we're at an edge point where it could go either way. Because I think, although I fully support Michael's drivers, I think the dampeners may bite back. And I think that we could get a tsunami of inequity with lots and lots of job losses when the support for people through the pandemic stops. And we could lead to a time of greater uncertainty for young people and families. We could see, I think, a reversion to the status quo. Actually, I think the status quo is very attractive to those who benefit from it. And those who benefit from it are often those who are in power. I speak as someone who listened yesterday to the Minister for Education in England say what he wanted to get back to what they were doing with children in rows and with a focus on students behaving properly. That's what he wanted to get back to when the pandemic was over. So I think there's a crux issue here. I think it could go either way. And I think it's down to us as leaders to do all we can within our own sphere of control to make it go the right way, to go for the drivers rather than dampeners. But I think there's a battle to be had and it's all to play for, but let's not think it's going to be an easy thing to move towards the drivers away from the dampeners, because there's a lot of challenges ahead for us.
So Steve, without trespassing into the next round in which we are going to actually address the leadership that would be required to ensure that we don't go down the dystopia pathway, have you got, when you cast your eye across geographies, because you've been working across different parts of the globe, I can understand your concern when you have a minister making those kind of comments in England. But where do you see more hopeful signs?
Yeah, I see lots of hopeful signs. I'm happy to say a bit more about that later on, perhaps, Tony, in terms of leadership. But I just think we should be, what I'm finding is everyone is saying the pandemic is proving to them that the answer is what they thought it was before. Whatever educational view they had before, whether that's right or left, whether that's traditional or progressive, it's reinforced their view of that for the future. So what I'm seeing is lots of different camps trying to jockey for position, not just in England. I'm seeing it in Australia. I'm seeing it around the world. I'm seeing lots of great things too. But I just think this is not like going to be an easy kind of path towards Michael's sort of vision for the future. That's all. Got it.
And the great thing about this is we're going to get chat, and it's really starting to flow with people who are in very different parts of the globe, right, where they see innovation of a kind that is very hopeful. And I know that's exactly what you're also saying. Valerie.
Tony, maybe I'll use the frame that futures thinkers often deploy in these kind of circumstances. The probable, the possible, and the preferred. And I think I have to say that I tend to agree with Steve that the probable is that in too many systems, there will be a snap back, a reversion to what there was, with some, possible kind of tweaks to that, perhaps a bit more blended learning, a bit more hybridization, that kind of thing, but not readily distinguishable from the existing paradigm, the existing model. And there's a whole range of reasons for that, not least the stresses on institutional leaders and the lack of bandwidth that they have to cope with both the kind of reintegration of young people into circumstances which are going to be a little bit uncertain, a little bit unsafe for some time to come, as well as all the other pressures upon them. So I fear that's a probable kind of non-new era, if you like. But a plausible or possible scenario, and it's there in Tracy Burns's 4, but I've kind of elided them into 3, is that the tech titans will do to education what Amazon has done to shopping, and that we will see an increasing disintermediation, that we will see technological offers which appear to render schools irrelevant and redundant. It freezes my blood, and I think it's all too possible. Perhaps as we speak, there's a suite of people working in Silicon Valley, or possibly Jack Ma, I don't know, who are working on precisely this outcome. And we won't know until it hits. So that's a possible. My preferred, of course, would be a completely new narrative around the purposes of education, and flowing from that, a series of different outcomes, a different way of thinking about success, a different way of talking about what we want for our young people in terms of their outcomes. And here I make a connection with what Adenike had to say. The outcome of thinking in that way about thriving planet, thriving societies, thriving interpersonally, and thriving intrapersonally as an individual. It means, in effect, that you turn things inside out. What used to be peripheral, stuff around social emotional, stuff around environmental learning. Notice I'm saying stuff around, because it was all kind of nice to have peripheral at the edges, add on little modules. And actually that now has to be the very heart of learning. And turning it inside out like that, and by God, as Michael was saying, there are teachers and leaders around the world who are deeply, deeply into this and want it very passionately. And they understand what it means to turn it inside out, so that we are thinking about thriving in a planetary sense, in a global sense. By the way, I do want to just add in, as I'm, if allowed 1 more minute, that I sometimes worry that is a very highly anthropocentric view of all of this purpose. It's easy to talk about human flourishing, so that's obviously what we're all about. But increasingly, I'm just possessed of the view that it's not just about us thriving. It's about our planet as a whole. It's about other species. Yeah. It's about the natural system of which we are a part and not its master. So in a sense, that spiritual shift of our relation to all of that is very fundamental to it as well. So of course, my preferred new era would be the interconnection of all the kind of collaborative efforts, new pedagogies for deeper learning, what's going on in 100 countries around the world, with terrific activists modeling new ways of learning, such as Glenn is doing, new ways of leading, such as many young people, led by Greta Thunberg, are doing, into really vibrant forms. But to get there, and I'll come back to something Michael said, we have to engage with the politics. And we have kind of thought that we can just carry on doing interesting pedagogical work and the politics will stay out of it. And it will be the politics that's the roadblock, because they create the narrative, they make the investments, they create the regulatory frameworks. The possibilities are either enabled or constrained by the political dialogue and the political narrative. And that is where I'm trying to suggest that we need to encourage a different kind of narrative, dialogue, discourse, different vocabulary almost, for what is a good life, and therefore what's a good education.
So let me ask Michael for a kind of half-time reflection, Michael, because I'm watching the chat as well, right? And I've got everything from, by the way, Valerie, it's interesting, people are picking up on your language of a new narrative rather than the language of transformation. So that might be worth returning to later. But also, but also, Steve, I think you've encouraged people to think this could go any number of ways. And yet there's clearly a compelling narrative around our own very survival that Andonike has actually articulated here, and the power of young people, right, to find solutions. So, Michael, what's your reflection? Would you? I'll be even sharper. Do you think that the beginning of your paper needed to be more powerful in terms of a new narrative, or do you think you're pretty much in the same space as what you've been hearing?
I think we're in the same space, but I think I need to add something given this panel. And it is, first, a lot of the changes that have been tried, in a sense, have been a function of being frustrated with the existing system. So they do end runs and create the innovative alternatives. And I like that. And I think there's a source of energy for that. But I want to add to the challenge. I didn't quite say it this way in the paper, but the challenge is, what are we going to do with the existing public school system? What are we going to do with it? Not just do end runs, not even the comprehensive stuff that Valerie writes about, but how do we, as we create the alternatives, how do we dismantle as well as get inside the other one? And in our deep learning work, we work only with mainly with public school systems. 600 schools in Uruguay, Newfoundland, Labrador, all 250 schools of the province. So we're trying to get, and all of us know this, there are a lot of allies within the public school system right now, students and teachers who don't like what they're experiencing, who want an alternative. So they've got, and some of those people are in positions of authority going upward. And so I think, and I don't have the answer, but I do have the question. The question is, attack productively the existing school system, so we make it as hard as possible for it to preserve and as easy as can be for it to start finding its way into the comprehensive solutions, not the not the special sub solutions. I love Glenn's work, and Annika, I think that stuff is really, we need to see it, and I don't expect them to do it because they're creating it, but let's figure out here, this is about, I use the word dampening the wrong drivers. I could have said a stronger word. It's more than dampening, but it is dismantling the wrong drivers, dismantle them and reposition them and relate where the right drivers, all four right drivers are powerful. They anticipate the right drivers, each of the four in combination, anticipate everything that can go wrong.
Okay, just before I move to the second round, which is going to be a focus, Steve, on what you already anticipated, namely, in my language, at least to borrow from you, the kind of leadership that we're going to need in order to get to what I would argue here is a narrative that is more around a preferred future than a probable or a possible. But is there any other reaction to what you've heard from each other at this point? Okay, then I'm going to move. That's how. Okay, Glenn. Yeah, you want to come in first?
Sorry.
I'm going to move into the leadership space in a minute. But did you want to respond to something that you've heard first?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question I like to throw out to even the audience. I mean,
Yeah, good.
In general, especially in the United States, like nepotism versus meritocracy, like they're on the opposite ends of the spectrum, right? And so when we're talking about disrupting university systems that like have an emphasis on meritocracy, the issue isn't just with the university. The issue is like the companies that have that demand the highest wages or that provide the highest wages, like being a part of that system because it's essentially one and the same. So the question then boils down to incentive. What incentive is there to boil it down and open it up if the gatekeepers are trying so hard to keep things a certain way? So it's just a question out to the audience.
Yeah, fantastic. And people are coming in and picking up on precisely what you've just raised. And I'm going to try and circle back on a couple of implications of that as we come toward the end of our panel session. But Glenn, let me pass to you on what it might take in terms of what we're calling here change maker leadership. So as you think about the direction of travel that you want to see, and you think about your own leadership, what constitutes the kind of leadership that you think is really going to make the difference here? And how can you think about that leadership in a way that will help us on this journey? Because this is not just for the next year, right? This is, well, at least we're arguing on this session for the next decade. So share some of your ideas.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to what I was saying about taking the labor out of learning, because at the end of the day, if incumbent systems are either boring kids to the point where they're not engaged, like then people are going to fall into line a certain way. Or if there's content that's out there that is distracting towards specific goals, like literally nothing is going to happen. And so in terms of whatever your outcome is, like literally make it fun for students, literally make it engaging for even adults, so that there's an emphasis on, for us, for example, like we have our app, and our app is geared towards middle school students specifically, but we have a broader curriculum that a parent and a student can do together and see this exciting dynamic content through their phone. I think the through line is simply like, we can't, while kids are prone to creativity and thinking of things that we cannot see, we also can't put all the burden on them to just whatever we deliver is whatever academics create, that we're just gonna like hammer fist it over their heads and then think it's going to work. Because if the essence of what we're looking for is creativity in a new system, we have to do it in a way that's accommodating to the next generation as well.
So Glenn, you wouldn't use the language then. I'm not wanting to be unnecessarily provocative, but Dominic said from this morning, he got a sense of leadership for empathy, leadership that is adaptable, leadership that is responsive. That's not the language you're using.
I mean, it has to be, when I'm saying responsive, I mean like, what's the word I'm looking for? So something that we make sure that we're emphasizing in our curriculum is like culturally responsive pedagogy, culturally responsive education, right? Like literally the content that's on the SAT, for example, like major college admissions tests in the US, like there are Black and brown communities that like aren't exposed to some of the words due to socioeconomic circumstances. And that's a whole conversation in itself. But the boiled down point of all I'm trying to say is that, like, if nobody cares, nothing is going to happen.
Yep. And by the way, here's a link, and I'd love you to make a comment on it. And Antonike, can you do the same in a moment? There are a number of people who are saying, why are we talking about a curriculum? Are we still caught in some previous paradigm? What's your own view? Because you both used the language of curriculum. What do you mean by it, Glenn?
Yeah. I mean, I think that a certain level of standardization is necessary in any case, because without it, then we don't have, like, we in the US, for example, like there are every state has its standards, and we still don't know how to talk to each other in terms of major issues. We're still a crazy polarized nation. So if we're moving away from a standard curriculum, and we're in a place where we literally don't even know how to communicate, it's only going to amplify chaos and tension, in my opinion. So our organization wants to at least make sure that like everyone has a foundation of certain knowledge and everyone is on the same page. But that's at a baseline. Now, when we're talking about curriculum, it's not about the traditional spelling book where you're reading and writing, and it's not about memorization. It's about emphasizing creativity. It's about finding insights. It's about emphasizing critical thinking. That in itself we can redefine what curriculum means, but from at the very fundamental level, there still needs to be a base where everyone understands where they're coming from.
So, Adenike, let me say this. If all of us share to some extent some of the dimensions of a preferred future, right? I'll just make that as assertion for a moment. Yep. The kind of leadership that's going to get us there, from your point of view, is what? And can you personalize this as much as you like? Because you are yourself a leader. So we are trying here to figure out what kind of change maker leadership is going to give us the best chance here to tackle exactly the issues that Steve and Valerie raised in their first responses. So where do you sit on the leadership challenge?
I think for leadership, we need to build or to educate more emotionally intelligent leaders. With technology these days, is like a lot of young people are so far away from reality. The emotional intelligence is a little bit not too strong. So I feel that if we're going to move into the next era, especially with AI technologies that the new era is moving into, we need to have more emotionally intelligent leaders. Obviously, I'm more of an environmentalist, so I believe that we should have more eco leaders, no matter what sector that you're in. We should encourage more of, for me, I feel encourage more of outdoor education. Outdoor education will allow people to be inspired by nature, and by doing that, they become more flexible in their ways of thinking and more, show more empathy in terms of leadership. So yeah, more emotionally intelligent leaders, because technology is just moving us away from connection, human connection.
And by the way, what's your view about how leadership is shared and distributed? So you think about your own work. Who do you define as being the leaders?
I think for me, leaders are the students, really. You want to be able to, we don't want to, as much as we want to follow a curriculum, we also want to make sure that we're not restricting students to think creatively. So leadership should be encouraged. We should be more of, as teachers or as educators, we should be more of listeners. Then allow students to make their mistakes, allow them to learn, allow them to be leaders so that they can, lead doesn't mean that everybody has to be on top, but we can all be what I call maybe servant leadership or servant leader, in which everybody has, have a sense of responsibility. And if we have a sense of responsibility and a shared collective, it will inspire shared collective action in our communities. So yeah, students should be more of a leaders. They should be more active in learning than being more passive. Because the old curriculum says, especially in a place like Nigeria, when teachers are teaching, educators are teaching their students, you don't talk back where your teacher is teaching. You just listen. The teacher is the almighty. He knows everything. You can't question them. You can't even ask questions until the teacher said, do you have any questions? And I don't think that's a good way to raise. I think we're just raising for just to become maybe more of employees that don't question anything. So yeah, we should definitely, leaders, when I think about leaders, I think about my students. I think about my students. Yeah.
Understood. Steve, beyond imperfect leadership?
Okay, Tony, can I first of all talk about who and then how? I mean, for who, I think the young people are crucial here, absolutely crucial. It's their world that they're going to shape. But I would say, although they're probably the most important people we need to be empowering, we also need to be empowering the next step up people. People are the new teachers, not the experience. Who are the people who are about to become teachers? The people who are about to become school leaders, the people who are about to become system leaders. These are the people who we should be getting to shape the future, not the ones who've been there for a very long time. It's the world they're going to step up into that they can help to shape. So the who are the young people and those who are about to start in those next kind of levels up. In terms of the how, the book I wrote was called Imperfect Leadership, a book for leaders who know they don't know it all. And at a time of uncertainty and change, that's desperately what we do need. We need leaders who know they don't know it all. We need leaders who are open-minded. At the moment, in places like the States and UK, we've got people in different camps. We've got people who are forming battle lines. We've got the Trump and the non-anti-Trump in the States. We've got Brexit, anti-Brexit in the UK. But in education, we're getting battle lines being drawn. And I think what's desperately needed is people not to think that they have the perfect solution, but to be what Vivienne Robinson would say is truth-seeking rather than truth-claiming. It's about being open-minded. It's about spending, it's empathy. It's about, I wonder why people are saying that, which I disagree with that, but why are they saying it? How can I understand why they're saying that? So we'll never have a consensus or a critical mass to improve our education system unless we understand why other people are thinking differently. So I think this is a really significant point. I'm all for a compelling narrative. Of course, I'm for a compelling narrative. I spent my life developing compelling narratives, but I'm also all for understanding that I don't know it all, that I need to spend some time in the other person's shoes. I have an open-mindedness approach, that I need to invite and ask for help rather than thinking I've got all the answers. And unless we have leaders who have got that frame of mind, we're not going to be able to shape successfully the kind of narrative that Michael has so eloquently set up for us.
Thank you. Valerie.
Well, if you talk about change maker leadership, it's got at least two senses, hasn't it? There's the making of change makers. So leadership of institutions which are themselves intent upon enabling their learners to become change makers through the whole kind of panoply of pedagogical and curricular innovations that enable learner agency. And that's a whole territory of teacher expertise, which I think we're just getting into, elevating learner agency to a really important position in whatever an institution does. That's one meaning. But the one I really want to concentrate on is being a change-making leader yourself. And I will come back to this notion that the conversation, and when I say narrative, Steve, I'm not saying that this is how it is and I know everything about it. I'm talking about the nature of the discourse. I'm talking about the very concepts that we employ. And I emphasize that I fundamentally believe that unless we change the nature of that conversation about education, that we will not get the kind of, yes, I'll use the T word, the transformation that we need. Because the dominant narrative right now, and it's so dominant, it's not even noticed, is a fundamentally economistic one. It's economistic at the level of nations. We invest in education because it will create greater prosperity, usually measured by GDP. And we do it for individuals because it will give them a jump in the vocational stakes. They'll get into better universities and they'll get better jobs. And the whole story, and storytelling is really important here, is about, here's how it works. You work hard in school, whether you're engaged or not, Glenn, you get stuck in, you get your qualifications, you get to college, or you're cast on the scrap heap fundamentally. You get to a better college, you get into better jobs, and you have a better life. And we all know that's busted. I mean, that's blown. We have to rethink the way in which we give dignity to different kinds of achievement, different kinds of intelligence, different kinds of ways of contributing, that we see what a nurse does or a truck driver as having dignity, and that you are not cast on the scrap heap and of no value if you don't get to college and get a degree. By the way, coming back to Michael's wounded victors, if you like, everyone suffers in the end. But we need a different story around that, a different set of stories that elevate different ways of achieving, different ways of living your life, actually, of thriving at so many levels that will inform what a system looks like. Now, I think in terms of change maker leadership, Tony, I think that's going to entail us all getting involved in different kinds of conversations, whether it's conversations with parents in an institution, conversations with learners themselves, certainly conversations with politicians whom I think we need to enable to conduct this kind of debate on different terms without fearing that they're going to be ridiculed and made to look absurd because they're coming up with some wishy-washy, floppy stuff that isn't hard-edged, you know, the way the economics used to be, even though the old economic story has also been blown out the water, by the way, by a whole range of forces. So I'll stop there, but I do think the capacity of leaders to start different kinds of conversations so that we're seeing this whole enterprise quite differently is the pathway to getting change at all the levels we need to make. And I think we've got the tools to do it now. I think we've got the tools to do it. And by the way, one thing that the pandemic has done has invited people to ask what it is they really value. They might forget about that, but if we can take the moment where people have reconsidered what it feels like to be in nature, what it feels like to meet a friend and be close to a friend, what it feels like, you know, to, well, you know, I don't need to carry on. So the value frame maybe is up for grabs now, but we need to get that really moving into serious, rigorous conversations about how learning can be reshaped.
I'm going to come back, Michael, just before I ask you for a reflection, I'm going to then come back to my 4 panel members and ask you to make one final contribution, which will need to be short and sharp, but it's this. If we were having this conversation in a year's time, I'm not going to say a decade's time, even though I know we're talking about the decisive decade, we're talking about a moonshot. I'm more in the space, Valerie, that you are about what would be an indicator that we're on the right path? Just at least an indicator from each of the 4 of you that we are heading in a direction, to use the earlier language, of a preferred future. But before I ask you to do that, Michael, you put up a slide in which you attempted to capture the leadership that was going to be necessary. From what you've heard, a 2-minute reflection, would you shift? Would you re-emphasize?
No, I would operationalize it additionally, just in terms of what I've heard. So a couple of interesting points. Oscar Wilde said, anything worth learning cannot be taught. So that, and I think what Glenn was talking about, taking the labor out of learning, was about that. And it's really not, and he would say it this way, I'm sure too, it's not that learning is laborious. It's laborious when it's not interesting, or it's not intrinsically motivating. That's when it gets laborious. So that we've got that movement. Secondly, I think, and I just put a plug in, I don't know why, but for the 10 to 12-year-olds, I think the 10 to 12-year-olds, and I think maybe that's what Glenn is dealing with, they've got enormous change agentry. I know another project where they're focusing on this, and the amount of energy the 10 to 12-year-olds, it's all young people, but I just want to highlight that. And then the last point, which is a new one, is I think we need to cultivate, or I don't know what the word is, leaders who are high up in the existing bad school system. I'm talking about sometimes ministers, sometimes directors of education, sometimes superintendents of education. I don't mean that we're going to get very much here, but in addition to coming and developing the alternatives, I think there is a openness now. I think the upper leadership, and I think the economic system that Valerie referred to, is no longer embraced the way that we feared 10 years ago. If you look at the Women Economists, it is talking about alternative to GDP. It's talking about alternatives to economic outcomes, but the alternatives are spelled out as tied in with well-being and development. They're very specific. So I'd like to see us think about dismantling the existing public school system in a way where we cultivate allies. We don't just criticize the system, and that we build up the alternative at the same time.
Yep, got it. I just wish we had more time to move into that territory that you and Valerie are really relating to here, particularly Valerie, your earlier point about the importance of the politics of education while we're on this journey. But time has elapsed, and I've got the opportunity for one final comment from each of you in the spirit that I suggested. But whatever you want to say, you'll say. So Glenn, a final comment?
Yeah, the final comment is on incentive. Right now, any corporation in the United States, like they can pursue shareholder profits by any legal means necessary. And so we've seen recently, like Fortune 500 CEOs have come together and they're starting to have a focus more on stakeholder interests versus shareholder interests. I think that in order to change the education system, that has to be codified in the law. So like what a B Corp is, for example, and those standards, I think that all of that will then will then have an impact of what these companies are looking for in the hiring processes, which will impact the skill sets that will be necessary, which will impact what will be taught in the classroom. So I think it has to start at the top.
Fantastic. Adenike, final comment.
Yeah, for a few seconds, I want us all to imagine a world where we reduce poverty and inequality, tackle climate change, promote vibrant democracy, and protect biodiversity. But these are just noble intentions conveyed by words. For us to actualize this, or at least be close to achieving it, education must be reimagined at all levels by raising resilient and vibrant young leaders whose education transcends beyond the rhetorics of culture, curriculum, and communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Steve.
Yeah, when I talk about open-minded leadership, I'm not talking about weak leadership. I'm not talking about wishy-washy leadership. I'm talking about very strong, courageous leadership. But it's leadership which is compelling but invitational. And that's the key point. Compelling but invitational. An exciting future, but asking for help. Asking people to come and shape it with us, rather than we'll tell you what the answer is. And that's, I think, the leadership that's now needed.
Thank you. And Valerie.
Well, I think the provoking question you chucked at us, Tony, was what would be an indicator that we were moving in the right direction? I think that's what I heard you said. So for me, I think it would be that, well, first, that education moved up the political agenda from 10th or 11th or 12th to somewhere a bit closer to a serious debate. You know, it's just pretty much ignored, other than they will chuck in, we'll invest more, you know, we'll get more kids into university, because of course that's all that matters. So one, to Michael's point really, that it moves up the political pecking order and becomes an issue of serious consideration. And if that were to happen in a context where there was really thoughtful debate about what the thing was for, why we invested multi-billions in this social system and what it's for, that would be terrific. And I think the most tangible sign of that in the short term would be, because it's the bottleneck, would be a rethinking of assessment, which is almost a crime against humanity at the moment. And if you wanted a single indicator that actually people are starting to get it, that we've gone seriously wrong around the elevation of academics, I mean, some of the things that Michael touched on and a range of others as well, then that would be a really sharp indicator too.
Well, I love that, because it's very interesting, isn't it, that the two places at the moment that are absolutely obsessed about doing that work are the UK and the US. And it just happens to be, Michael, the focus of the next in the series of papers, of which yours was the first. So, colleagues, can I, on your behalf, thank all of our panel members. Fantastic session. Michael, I want to thank you for framing this as you did, and actually moving us into the territory of what kind of leadership is going to be adequate to this challenge. And clearly we're going to have to address the other two major issues that we are going to now focus upon, both the challenge around equity and obviously the opportunity for next generation leadership to help us to drive toward a preferred future. So, colleagues, on behalf of all of you, could you just indicate your appreciation? Thank you very much. And we are on a break, and you are being invited to return on the hour. So thank you.
Thank you, Tony.
Hey, thank you, Michael. Thanks, guys. That was fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Glenn, I've got to come and see your stuff. Adenike, I'm going to come and visit you. I'm just going to do a wander around now.
You assume the possibility of travel, Tony. Amazing.
I've got to get back in the air.
What an idea! Wild idea.
Got to get back in the air. Hey, that was great. Yeah, a lot of energy. Thank you very much for all the contribution. So
Thanks for chairing it so well, Tony, as ever.
thank you, dear friends. Wonderful. All right, we'll reconnect. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Take care.
Bye.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Thank you for rejoining us. What an outstanding opening to the conference that was. A fantastic keynote from Michael, and then a really interesting and thought-provoking panel discussion around changemaker leadership. They've given us an awful lot to play with and think about over the next two panels. I'm really excited to be moderating this one. We have three phenomenal speakers joining from very different contexts and different parts of the world. Our theme is around leading to bridge the equity chasm. I think the issue of equity came up in a number of different ways in both Michael's keynote and the panel discussion. And, you know, one of the big takeaways from last year is, you know, last year wasn't really just about the pandemic at all. There were multiple crises that people were experiencing in different ways. And I've heard the year referred to, I've used the phrase myself about 2020 being a year of convergent crises. So yes, there was the pandemic, obviously, which impacted on all of us, and in many ways shone a much needed light on different manifestations of the learning crisis and inequality in education, both in terms of outcomes and opportunity. But then there was also the climate crisis, that accelerated in many ways last year, and there were more extreme weather events that impacted on people's livelihoods and lives in different ways. There was also the struggle for racial equity that accelerated forward, spearheaded in many ways by Black Lives Matter movement in the US, but then also visible in many other countries. So this idea of multiple crises coming together, all of which have issues of equity at their very heart. So as I said, we've got three fantastic speakers joining on this panel. The format will be each of them is going to introduce themselves and say a little bit about their work and their perspective on this idea of leading to bridge the equity chasm. Tony Jackson is going to speak first. After that, Najine Paul Delkhori will speak from Haiti, and then Leah Bitat will talk about some of the work that she has been doing in Algeria. Once the three of them have made their opening remarks, we'll move into a conversation between the four of us. And panelists, as we said when we were prepping for this, I would really encourage you to ask questions of each other and feel free to jump in to the conversation. You all have such fantastic ideas and lenses on this topic that I'm looking forward to a really rich conversation. And for the audience, please feel free to post questions and comments in the chat, and we will try to pick up as many of them as we can as the panel progresses. So Tony, if I could hand to you first, please, sir.
Sure, I appreciate that, Dominic, and welcome everyone to our panel. I'm Tony Jackson. I'm Vice President for Education and the Director for the Center for Global Education at Asia Society. And I'll just say a few words about our center, and just really to say that the Center for Global Education is very well aligned in what it does in working in schools and working at systems level to certainly the paper that Michael Fullen wrote recently called The Right Drivers for Whole System Success. And I'm presuming the remarks he made in his comments, it was a bit early for me to catch his presentation here in Los Angeles, California, but I read the paper and I resonated very deeply with it. And I think namely that education needs to fundamentally be redesigned to promote what both he and we call global competence, which we define as the capacity to investigate the world, to recognize and weigh perspectives, to communicate ideas across cultures, and ultimately to take action. So in my just brief remarks this morning, I want to pick up on a couple of points that Michael made that I think really are absolutely critical. And parenthetically, what I have to say this morning quickly is more fully elaborated in an editorial that was published just yesterday called Teaching Truth to Power. And I think there'll be a link to that in the chat at some point this morning. But the first point is, as Michael noted, we really are, and Dominic reinforced, we really are at an inflection point in the history of humanity. It seems to me that what we are witnessing is the fact that previously functional operating paradigms are really now totally dysfunctional, and that it includes certainly in education, but also in elsewhere. And frankly, if we do not change, our very existence as a species is at risk. So when we think about leadership, given this kind of perfect storm of issues coming together in this year, I think we have to really ask the question, leadership for what? And I believe the answer must be leadership towards the kind of whole-scale systems change of the like that Michael so well described. I think the fundamental shift that is needed is essentially from a dysfunctional education system that really either explicitly or implicitly has the purpose of benefiting a few to the detriment of many, changing from that to an education system that has as its purpose learning and action for the common good. And so all the specific changes that Michael was speaking towards and what we do at our center is that they're vectored toward that outcome, learning and action for the common good. In other words, and why is that? I mean, I think it's because education purely for individual enhancement and group hegemony, in other words, the status quo today, that's really education for oblivion. So it follows then that if the purpose of education going forward must be toward advancing the common good, it must also be that young people that go through that system come out of it able and disposed to be agents of change for the common good. And I think that's ultimately what we want. We want children educated to be change makers for the common good. And to be change agents towards the common good means, by definition, to be agents for equity. So fundamentally, what we want, I think, is a redesigned education system to produce young people who do not reflexively view others who are different than themselves across lines of race or ethnicity or religion or gender or worth or wealth. We don't want kids who have a mindset that either regards people who are different as either a threat to be subordinated or a target to be exploited. Instead, what we want this redesigned education system to produce are youth that do not have this kind of dominance mindset, rather have a more egalitarian mindset that provides the psychological foundation for learning and acting for the common good. So leadership, to conclude, needs, frankly, in my view, to be focused on redesigning systems that produce youth who have the capacity and the mindset to advance equity and the common good, because they're the same thing. And so that, to me, is the leadership challenge I think we face. And I look forward to discussing these ideas with my good colleagues on the panel.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tony. An awful lot to think about. I think one of the themes that has come throughout today is the idea of leadership with humility, which I think touches on some of what you were saying as well, and about the importance of, as you said, as you put it brilliantly, leading for a common good rather than to benefit a few. Najin, you're joining us from Haiti. We'd love to get your opening thoughts on this, please, and reflect on your work.
Thank you, Dominic. Hello, everybody. My name is Najin Paul-Dewoli, and I am co-founder and CEO of Untitled Chapter in Haiti. And Untitled Chapter is a Haitian-led and Haitian-run movement equipping 50,000 local civic leaders for educational equity. And actually, we see education equity as a stepping stone towards liberation. And so that's the ultimate goal. And so much of what we do actually is rooted in how we began. So that founding team decided then and remains today allies of those who've been in the trenches and working for educational equity, especially in rural Haiti, for generations. And so when we began, we decided that we wanted to listen actively for several years, actually. We wanted to sit at the foot and at the feet of community elders and community members and ask them from a very asset-based perspective, when have we been at our best? When are we most mighty and most powerful as a people? And what came back to us is that when we know our culture, when we understand our customs, and when we are community tight and community rooted, that is the source of our power. But lo and behold, those 3 C's, as we call them, culture, customs, community, has been systematically and intentionally stripped from our education system in Haiti. And so at UNCIEP YET, we want to reintegrate those 3 elements in everything that happens in teaching and learning, because we know that we have to reclaim our power that way. And we do so by breaking down that wall that's been built up pretty artificially between the classroom and the community. And so our programming with teacher leaders, school leaders, and parent leaders is about reclaiming the power and making sure we're rowing in the same direction so that all kids get what they deserve. And so this topic and this panel conversation, I'm so interested in and grateful to be a part of it because it's super pertinent to the work that we do in Haiti. But there's a couple of things too that came up as we were talking about this panel and thinking about its topics. First is this idea of bridging the chasm, right? I think so often in our work, we talk about closing the gap. And so when we think of the gap, we think of those who are underserved or maybe marginalized. And what does it take to bridge that gap? But one of the things that we see in Haiti and at UNCIEP YET that is often problematic about the bridging the gap language and approach is that we often forget to ask the question, what is this benchmark, right? Why are we working so intently on getting here without maybe asking what did here define and who did define it? So the definition of academic achievement, the definition of wealth, the definition of well-being, as we all know, usually has a legacy of colonialism, imperialism, and often really supremacist tendencies. And so at UNCIEP YET, we want to redefine this benchmark so that we're really aiming towards celebrating the genius of our people and reclaiming our power. And then the other piece of this is this idea of school leadership, right? I think so often we try to define school leadership as being that person with power and authority to make decisions, but we forget to decentralize that power and include parents and students and teachers. And so at UNCIEP YET, we push back on those who ask us about really equipping only the school leader, because for us, real school leadership would not exist without student voice, teacher voice, parent agency, and of course the school administrators. And when people push back and say, but parents are sometimes unmotivated, they're absent, they're not interested in taking part in this, we respond and refute that stance only because if you're living in a community that has been marginalized for so long, whether directly or indirectly, usually parents have received signals. They've received signals that have told them that their place is not at the decision-making table. So if my grandparents, my parents, and now I am receiving signals that I am not welcome in my mother language, in my own full self at the table, I wouldn't be surprised that I'm not accepting the next invitation. And so at UNCIEP YET, we challenge everyone, including our peers, to one, address and take accountability for the signals that have been set and some of the ways in which that's perpetuated still today. And so I'm looking forward to this panel, but I think there's a lot of different ways that we can challenge some of the terminology and the approaches that we take to make sure that all kids are getting what they deserve.
That was brilliant. Thank you, Najin. And I think immediately there's some really interesting connections with what Tony was saying. I love your idea about equity isn't the goal. Equity is just a stepping stone to something which equity should be the baseline that we're starting from, and everything that comes with flourishing and thriving is beyond equity, as you put it, around liberation. And also the idea of, as Tony was talking about education for the common good, and you're talking about helping all of the students who are part of the schools that you work with experience that common good because it's in the community rather than just in the classroom. And then what both of you were saying about being super sensitive to the language of dominance and where benchmarks and standards are set by a dominant group in a colonial context. Leah, you're going to talk about, your work in Algeria, which is obviously, also has a colonial legacy that it's grappling with. So we'd love to get your opening thoughts, if that's okay.
Great, thank you. And it's really such a pleasure to be part of this conversation. It's so inspiring, even our pre-conversations, doing some of the reading. I really resonating around this idea of moonshot. So thank you, Michael, for putting that out there today. I think it's really working in Algeria, which is really an unknown country. Probably most of you don't know. It's the largest country in Africa. Most people don't even really know it's there. It's had an amazing, education is deeply valued within the country. after independence in 1962, they had an 11% literacy rate amongst the indigenous Algerians. Within 50 years, we're able to get that to between 86 and 90%, depending on the demographics. Equity and access, they've achieved at an admirable rate. Education is free, open to everyone. I've done a lot of work in the Sahara for the nomadic people, creating access. Universities, free, open to everyone, huge universities. Quality is coming. Quality is where the work is. Equity of achievement and especially realignment with the competencies that we've been talking about today, real world readiness. For me, it's an ideal opportunity. Having worked in many spaces along this moonshot, I'm really now, that's my new image right now. I started my work in education as an educational advocate, 24 years old, going into the schools that I grew up in very small town, Alaska, knowing the law on inclusion, seeing it's not being applied, and just telling teachers on behalf of families, this is the law, you need to do it. And being puzzled, why aren't people saying, oh, we didn't know, of course, we'll do that tomorrow. Getting pushback on how. So doing my graduate work on policy making, but especially grassroots organizing. Okay, well, if the law says this, how do you get a system to implement change? So studied risk and prevention in education, setting up systems. But I thought, well, if I'm going to really have any credibility on this, I should try teaching. And saw, oh, okay, I get why those teachers were pushing back and saying, oh, is it that easy? So really trying to make change from within the system. Well, let's set up inclusive classrooms. Took about 5 years before I thought I'm not, damaging the kids at all. Tried building level leadership. Okay, I can make a great classroom, but what about the larger system? Trying district level leadership and saying, now I'm out of the classroom. Now I'm coaching people to effect change. I also worked in the zone of special education. This is something that's fascinating to me too, that role between policy and regulation and actual behavior in classrooms. And so pretty quickly, if you've got an inclusive mindset, it starts in your mind. You know that it's the right thing and you want to do it. You're willing to be guided. If you don't want to get there, you can legislate, you can do all of these things, but honestly, your heart and your mind have got to be in there. So coming to Algeria, having the opportunity, I wear two hats in Algeria. I work in the development world. I work for World Learning, which is the only American NGO in Algeria. And we've worked a lot with the ministries to do teacher training, capacity building. I've worked with universities. I've worked with the national education system. Haven't seen the impact of that work yet. Millions of dollars invested there, not seeing the impact. As a mother too, of an Algerian American and seeing, again, I'm over here, at the top level, helping people, talk to ministries about real world skills, soft skills, perseverance, these things, how to build better evaluations. At the same time, my child is in a school where maybe he's learning French, he's learning Arabic, he's learning some really wonderful life skills, but his critical thinking skills are gone. He's learning how to memorize, copy, that post-colonial sort of French, even Arabic approach to education. So at the end of that, if we're going to call it a moonshot, said, all right, let's be the astronaut, let's be everything. Well, let's do it on our own. So started a model, calling it a model school. Let's just show how this looks. That's where I'm really seeing, we were talking in our prep, and I was saying, I tell our staff all the time, we are not calling the ministry to ask them how this is supposed to go. We can call the ministry and say, look, this is what we're doing. Does this match with your priority? Because at this point in my career, I'm seeing what I really enjoyed what Michael was calling it, constellations. I'm really resonating with that piece of school-based leadership, and networks of schools is where the leadership is. We know what the best practice is. We need to have the courage to put it into place, group together and talk up and say, look what's working. Can we do more of this? What I don't, to be honest, when I'm in Algeria, I don't do these panels anymore because there's too much just debate. They take a very French approach with le débat. Let's talk about the problem. Let's talk about the problem. I've seen impact on let's create action. Let's quantify, let's show how it works. And let's invite people to celebrate that progress for it. But what that takes from the leader is to be very up on what works. That's where I focus. What works to create the safe space within your educational environment. I was speaking at our pre-conference. Teachers are terrified of inspectors in Algeria. Again, it's an old French approach of an inspector is going to come in and is going to want to see, are you on page 3, number 3 of the same textbook that we're supposed to be using for all 10 million students in this country? And so at the beginning, 7 years ago, yes, Leah, this is great, but what about the inspection? And I tell them the inspection is my problem. Leadership, I'm going to get in trouble for what we have to do. I'm here to prod, protect, and create the space for you to work. The pleasure in that is now, but also I'm the one to communicate with the ministry and say, come and look, is this what you would like? Invite them to validate the work that we're doing. And so I think the last thing that I wanted to say is what I'm really taking away from the conversations that we're having today, but is the importance for collaboration, networking, because it's very easy for that leader to start questioning or to get worn down. You're bearing the brunt of the anxiety.
Leah, you may have been a victim of the storm which is striking while we wait for you. Oh, you've reconnected. Thank you so much for all of that. And I think particularly for the kind of cautionary words about not letting this just be a talking shop and thinking about the call to action and the experience that all of you, have in that sphere. I'd like to come back, if it was okay, to something, Tony, you said about leadership for what? It's leadership for system change. All of you are working towards that in your different systems. I wondered if we could spend a bit of time thinking about practical examples of where you've had successes in terms of leading towards system change. And so, Tony, I don't know if you'd be happy to kick something off around that.
I'll start.
Yeah,
but I was really interested in hearing what my panelists would say, so I was holding back. But anyway, I'll just say, one of the things we do at our work in the Center for Global Education, we actually have we take deep dives into systems that have really proved to be highly effective, and particularly around issues of equity. We've looked very deeply at Toronto, for example, and this comes probably back to Michael. But one of the things that we observe there that I think really stands out in my mind is how the case was made for change through gathering evidence. And that involved both gathering data and then not shying away from the reality that it told. So in Toronto, for example, I mean, they could be very proud of the fact that they have something like 86% of all students succeeding in graduating high school on time, for example. But what they chose to look at is the 14% that weren't, and asking why. Why is that the case? And not why are they failing, but how are we failing them? How are we not enabling those kids to learn? And so it's, again, both a use of evidence and a use of a different mindset as to how you interpret that evidence, to ask very tough questions that ultimately come back to things like, do we care if they succeed? Because it just happens, coincidentally, I'm sure, that these generally are Black boys more than any other kinds of kids. And so issues of like, are we unconsciously or consciously advancing racist systems that have the outcome of this 14% of kids, often Black boys, being the ones who aren't succeeding? And so first, telling the truth to ourselves, I think, is a critical aspect of leadership, and not being afraid of it. And the other kind of data, though, that I thought was particularly important that they brought to the fore, which I think is an act of genuine, courageous leadership, reflects something what Najim was saying, which is to ask parents what their experience of the system is. and they found, enormous discrepancies in the satisfaction, and with very clear articulation of why and how, the system was acting in racist ways that accounted for the children not doing well in school. And that became another evidentiary basis for saying, look, we cannot allow this to happen and go forward. We must make a change, and we also must engage parents as a constituency in support of that change. And so, to me, those ways of marshaling your case and marshaling your evidence and marshaling your constituency to support change are critical. And it gives you then the impetus to be able to take on the larger sort of bureaucratic system, which will come at you strong and hard to not allow change to happen for the better. So you got to get your stuff straight, got to get your people in line, and know that it's a battle. But that's what they did, and that's what I think is really critical.
I agree, Tony. I think for us in Haiti, like the evidence piece is really critical. For example, we're still battling this mother tongue of a language in teaching and learning in Haitian classrooms. And so 100% of Haitians speak our native tongue of Haitian Creole. And unfortunately, French is still the language of instruction. And I'm sure there's many other countries out there too who are still battling this idea that the colonial language is the right language to do teaching and learning. And one of the things that we used absolutely at Unsafe YET was the evidence, both qualitative and quantitative, to show that achievement results were through the roof, completely different. In our classrooms, 3 times higher, right? We went from about 30% of kids passing primary school to in our classrooms, 90+% because of using mother tongue instruction. And so instead of speaking about it superficially, the quantitative and qualitative data is critical. The only caveat is when the metrics are defined even within that paternalistic colonial system. And so the fact that the metric of achievement is still perpetuating this idea that it's about literacy and then at what speed rather than comprehension, right? Again, there's still a lot of work to be done within how monitoring and evaluation takes place to make sure that even the data is not feeding into the wrong narrative. The other piece too, in terms of like system change, to your question, Dominic, that's been really important for us has been healing, right? Because we know that a lot of the work that we need to do when it comes to inequity and oppression in education is about addressing the trauma that too many generations of people have experienced. But what we also know is that if the wound is still open, healing cannot take place. And so a lot of the work we've done, to give you a very specific example, is eliminating corporal punishment. Unfortunately, it's still a practice that takes place in Haitian schools. We know it's a direct legacy of our colonial past. It's not a Haitian practice, but has been fed down kind of the chain through generations. We couldn't address this issue by saying, do not use corporal punishment. Here is the law, do not harm kids. We had to go in and say, where did this practice come from? Why do we as Haitians in 2021 think it came from Haitians rather than from our colonial and kind of enslavement past? Why has it now become so internalized to us as an internal practice and as a discipline practice? And then we need to address the healing and the trauma that the teachers still relive every time they're in the classroom. Because for us, our teacher leaders are a product of a system they now need to dismantle. But if the healing hasn't taken place, we will not eliminate corporal punishment, even though it's illegal in Haiti. And so what we realized 3 to 4 years in is that 90% of our partner schools have eliminated corporal punishment by having really intentional healing practices and a direct addressing of the trauma that was instilled and some of the mindsets that said that power and corporal punishment equals discipline. Let's flip that on its head and say, in your homes and in your communities, how do we discipline children? We discipline them very differently, not corporal punishment. And so we want to feed that into how classroom practice takes place.
Does that connect with ideas about autonomy within the classroom as well? And teachers knowing that they have the leadership or the autonomy to be able to make changes like that. So it's about creating a sense of empowerment that isn't coming from the top down, but coming from within the individuals in the system.
I don't know if I would use the word autonomy, because I think for me, the top-down system that Leah beautifully described, it's very similar in Haiti, this idea that the inspector is coming, I have to be careful. It's a direct replication of colonial practice, right? Who is the overseer? Who is the person that's coming to tell me that I've either lost my job or I'm not doing it well, rather than reinforcing the positive practices that are actually leading towards children's well-being and learning. And so for us, instead of autonomy, sometimes we think about it from the perspective of collective responsibility. Because if the teacher is a member of the community, to Tony's point about common good, it is my collective responsibility to make sure that what I'm doing in the classroom benefits not just maybe my children in the future, but our entire community, because I know the parents of the children who are sitting in my classroom. And so I think if we don't have that virtuous cycle of feeding collective leadership and collective well-being into the conversation, with or without autonomy, I don't think real core practices will change.
And is that part of the
just
Tony, sorry.
I just thought I'd just a quick addition. I mean, I think Najeen is exactly right. It's not a matter of autonomy unto itself. It really is what she said as well. And I think of it in terms of power and trust. I mean, ultimately, you know, there has to be trust instilled and power instilled in the people who are teaching our children, that they will act in ways that enhance and are based on the values that we hold critical within our communities. And so if, you know, it's not a matter so much of like having the autonomy to use best practices, it's trust that they're going to do the right thing because they have the capacity to, and they're driven by a set of values that reflects the community's love of their children and what they want best for their children. So to me, that's the revolutionary aspect of what we're talking about here is and you know, it can be called teacher professionalism if you want to put it in that jargon, but it ultimately comes down to having, you know, the authority and power to be able to do what you know is right and do what you know is best for kids when you will probably, you know, be sanctioned in some way or other if the larger system has the opportunity to do so, if the larger system isn't bent on maintaining the status quo. So anyway, I just wanted to add that point.
Well, and I think what I'm hearing too, and what I'm seeing in our classrooms too, it's also not just self-confidence, but confidence in where those two worlds intersect. You know, I think, let's say in our classrooms, we're really working on the competencies of perseverance, effort, especially collaboration, interpersonal communication, group work, a sense of emotional well-being. And I think we're really succeeding on that point. And I really liked, you know, got a lot of also self-confidence for our system, you know, reading sort of Michael's work saying that, you know, reinforcing that is the core. However, the teachers are coming from the real academic world, let's say, that comes before the work world, which is still very much based on your exam results, based on the number of on your exam, you will be placed into a university program. You don't, and I talked about everybody can go to university in Algeria. You don't really get to choose which one or what you study. You're placed based on an exam score. So at the end of the day, the closer we get to that exam year, the higher the fear goes up, especially in the families. We've bought on, we see that our kids love coming to school. They feel safe, they feel happy. Is that enough? Is that enough? And so it took, you know, trying to figure out how do we navigate that? Because that fear and that anxiety also translates into sort of, you know, attacks. Their academic levels going down. We start to see this panic. Now that we can predict that and help the parents understand, look, we're preparing for two things. The exams are a very important part. We understand that there is this paradigm. This part of the environment has not evolved. This other side, we do know that after, your child will need these real world skills. We've got them both in mind. And taking that from a dialogue point of view, a reassurance point of view, but also for the teacher within that, it's very difficult for the teacher to be affecting these changes, knowing, yes, they do have to have a good score on that exam. And yes, that exam requires memorization and all of these things that we're fighting against. So it's having confidence and also seeing successes. And that takes time. Nobody wants to do something that's just, you know, sort of a good idea. People want to have trust and they want to see these things come into fruition. And so I've seen when teachers can share success stories, when teachers can be saying, you know what, I did this communicative approach can actually be applied in Arabic, which is usually taught by rote learning. When they start to talk to each other, when they start to share success stories, they can share those with parents, and everybody can have the confidence to keep pushing change and pushing change.
Leah, can I ask you a question about that? Because what I love about the confidence piece is that when we see what's happening, when I refer to breaking down the wall between classroom and community, is because we see confidence in communities. We see joy, we see healing, we see the sense of community. But then so much of what happens in classrooms is about breaking down some of that confidence, right? It's about calling you out when you have a wrong answer, or not even taking the chance to answer a question in case you get it wrong. And so one of the questions I had in your experience has been, what does it look like when we funnel those who have experienced inequity firsthand into the leadership positions and into the decision-making table, so that they are the ones who are starting to slowly disentangle and dismantle the reasons why this becomes such a perpetuation of oppression, right? Because I think a lot of what you're describing about the inspectors, about the people who are so strict on the exams, is those who are trying to perpetuate the status quo, rather than those who've done enough healing to know that I was caused harm, I experienced trauma, but I now want to do it differently by being at the leadership table.
Absolutely. And I think, I think we all know that incorporating parents into active leadership into schools has been a really powerful force for us. I think we still face that curious effect, though, of that some of our most supportive parents still come up against that moment of fear in which, and maybe it's that because in Algeria, the actual system, we're much too close to the former colonizers to have completely taken away that system. So, even your most, we've got wonderful, really artistic filmmaking, documentary, people who are helping us in many ways to push the story of a more appropriate education, a more interactive, positive discipline. And sometimes it's those actual parents who give us the most fear, because they're still running up against a very repressive system. However, the more that those voices are coming together, we use a lot of parent volunteers, parents as teachers, sharing, we've got some great journalists at the school who are working with the kids to develop voice and do reporting, and those journalists are being prosecuted out in the streets for their activity at the same time. However, that's where I've seen the consensus building, is getting the parent part in. There's still really, the pushback that we do get is from the old guard that's within the ministries. But it's a moment now of great change. So that's the approach that we've really been taking. We also take for our teachers, we do experiential training. We try to take teachers who can be in classrooms as assistants, seeing, experiencing, really understanding, oh, this is what it's about, before they start trying to be teachers, so that they can have a sense of a new environment as they try to build it.
Thank you, Leah. I appreciate that, because I think sometimes what is a little bit faulty in people's understanding of the conversation I think the four of us are having, is that if you get rid of some of the exams and the systems and structures around testing, all of a sudden rigor goes away. And I think one of the things we're seeing in Haiti is that, on the contrary, bringing in culture, customs, and a different approach to pedagogy actually can increase rigor and increase comprehension and academic achievement. And I think that's what we're trying to do, back to my point about redefining this benchmark.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would just add, I think it's exactly right. What we've tried to do in all our work is realize that, everything we're talking about in terms of pedagogical change, the ways in which you enable kids to really have a very different experience in education, it is still going to result in, and even more so, in high-level disciplinary and interdisciplinary learning. That's not being sacrificed, it's being enhanced. And that's actually, not a byproduct, but a very important thing. Knowledge and development capacity to think within disciplinary structures, that's a good thing. You want that. And so everything we're talking about here is not in sort of to move away from that. It's to do it better. It's to do it in a way that makes sense and has meaning for kids. I think one of the things that's so often lacking in schools is any understanding of, why am I doing this, what they're asking me to do? And so if it has contextual meaning, then you're going to see, just as Najim said, you're going to see scores rise. But I think it is a very important question that's being raised here about, how do we ask leaders to, if they even are, have a sense of healing and understanding of how they have been harmed and have a sense of confidence, how do you still have them operate within a system that has a lot of barriers to actualizing that power? And I think to a certain extent, it's the kind of thing you never learn in a school of education for leadership. And that's something along the lines of creative insubordination. You know, how do you actually operate within a system and, you know, sort of do those things you have to do to keep it off your back in order to get the actual learning happening in your classrooms that you want. And at the same time, how do you then use that learning to then change the system so that, you know, you don't have to have that sort of sense of insubordination or sense of sort of quiet revolution happening in your classrooms. It is actually what the system wants. That's the cycle we need to get into is change, evidence of change, using that to change the broader system, and then having that stimulate more change even further.
I smiled so widely when you said that, because so many of the recruits that we have for our fellowship programs, whether it's the teacher leaders, parent leaders, or school leaders, they're not the teachers of the year, right? They're not the ones getting all the accolades, because usually that's reinforcing the status quo that already exists in our society. We're looking, to put it nicely, the rebels, right? The people who are literally thinking outside the box. And unfortunately, insubordination in that way is seen as a negative thing. But I'm sorry, if we're talking about dismantling systems of inequity, we need some insubordination.
Mm-hmm.
If this conference seeds anything, if it was a MOOC or a qualification in creative insubordination, that would be a fantastic outcome. Leah, I cut across you, I'm sorry.
I wanted to share something that we do is we set up celebrations and invite the status quo and thank them for their support and their inspiration for things that they had absolutely nothing to do with. But we just make sure that we're very honorific and say, you know, we couldn't have done this without your wonderful support, and kind of convince them that, yeah, wow, we can do more of this.
We're close to the end of our time, so I wonder if I could ask each of you for a kind of final reflection. If you were giving advice to the 210 people who are with us on Zoom and the people who are watching on YouTube and Facebook and who watch on demand, if you were to make one recommendation for where people could concentrate their effort in terms of activating levers for change, this educating leadership for system reform, then from all of your experience, where would you recommend people starting? Najeen, would you kick off?
Yeah.
Sure, thank you so much, Dominic, and thank you to the panelists for this great conversation. Looking forward to how it can continue. And I have to say two things just in terms of recommendations. The first one is making sure that there is proximate leadership. And how we define that is those who've lived experience of inequity being the ones who are leading the charge. And this is not about listening to them, right? Let me just be very clear. I mentioned that at the beginning of my remarks, this idea of listening for a few years and still listening today. Listening is not enough. Are they at the decision-making table, and are they the ones leading the charge to dismantle systems of oppression and injustice? It's those who've lived experience of inequity who have to be at the front. And then the second recommendation that I would share is that let's be very careful that we do not define initiatives that do not center equity as innovations. I think we're doing a lot of that as educators and practitioners, calling things innovations that are not moving forward the cause of equity. It has to be equity centered for it to be innovative.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Najeen. Leah.
So just one thing, really like I'd been saying before, look for some things that are working. That's the piece that when you find a very inclusive environment, look for what's working there, partner with the people who are doing that, take the momentum that's already starting and keep it going, because you are very much pushing against a very established system that's working for people, and it's very difficult to make those changes. But if you keep in mind this idea that this is a moonshot, it takes concentration and it takes teamwork and it takes courage. So the courage part comes from, you know, we have to keep making progress, especially the more pushback that we're getting. And the constellation part is creating allies, find things that are working, actively reach out, actively partner, and create those networks for change, because you cannot do it on your own, and you will get much more inspiration and the courage that you need to do it within a network.
Thank you, Leah, and thank you for persevering with the storm-related technical difficulties at the beginning. Tony, to you,
Just
please.
quickly, I mean, I think everything that's been said is brilliant, and I love this panel. And I would just add that I think, you know, as we think about taking a moonshot, it has to be, you have to make sure that the base upon which this moonshot is going to take off is solid. And to me, that means being very, very clear on what you believe in and acting from that relentlessly. And if you believe in equity, you first need to understand what that means and what it looks like. And then everything has to be based on that value statement, that notion, and everything has to be questioned in relation to that value. And so I just would say that be really clear on what you care about as a leader, and what you're going to fight for, and what you're going to really, you know, take heat for, and what you're going to celebrate and be joyful when you see it happen, and lead from that value position, and take that moonshot based on that.
Thank you. So Tony, Najeen, Leah, thank you so much for being with us today, for sharing your expertise, your passion, and your insights from your different contexts. It's been a fabulous panel, an enormous amount to think about. I'm going to hand over now to my esteemed colleague, Susan Douglas, who is going to be our moderator for the final panel of today's conference on amplifying next generation voices in leading learning. Susan has an absolutely spectacular lineup of speakers for her panel, and I'm really excited about this next session. Susan.
Thank you, Dom. Thank you. And hello and warmest greetings to you all today, in whichever time zone you find yourself. As Dom's just said, my name is Susan Douglas. I'm one of the senior schools advisors at the British Council, so the UK's cultural relations organisation. And I'm also the chief executive officer of the Eden Academy Trust, which is a group of 7 government schools here in England, all of which cater for children with special educational needs and disability. So Leah, I know you'll enjoy hearing that. I'm absolutely delighted to be hosting the final panel, as Dominic said, of today's events on amplifying next generation voices in leading learning. And I'm really excited about introducing our all-female panel to you this afternoon, which comprises Erica Butau from Ensinia, Brazil, Cecilia de la Paz, founder of Educate Uruguay, and Roxy Pania from High Resolves in the USA. I've been in education for 30 years this year, and it's been a real privilege to be so. You know, to do a day job that you love, I think is an enormous privilege. But I also think, you know, this year has been the most challenging one of those 30 years. For those of you that were just fortunate enough to hear the last panel, you will have heard Dominic talk about the fact that it was a year of convergent crises. He mentioned climate and the fact that, you know, if we respond to that crisis, it has the potential to change the way we live our lives. He mentioned the acceleration in the struggle for racial justice and against historical legacies of inequality. And then there was COVID, of course. And in school, we've had to deal with that, you know, so much in the here and now. Here in England, lots of children are going back to school for the first time on Monday, amidst a flurry of masks and social distancing and lateral flow tests. But as educators, we're very mindful of the potential impact of this health crisis on a generation of learners, not just in terms of education, not just in terms of the widening of the learning gap, and I suppose the inevitability that COVID will have exacerbated that gap for the most disadvantaged, but also in terms of the impact of the crisis on our young people's physical health, their mental health, the fact that, you know, more families will be struggling in terms of maybe their fiscal circumstances, moving into poverty, and the potential impact that might have on our children's recovery and on their future learning. So in light of all of that, we're going to divide our conversation into 2 sections, 2 enormous topics to do in 45 minutes, but we're going to try our best. So the first is really about the sort of curriculum that might be fit for purpose in these complex circumstances. And in particular, how do we amplify the voice of the next generation in shaping and leading that curriculum? And then secondly, what are the implications of that then for our system and school leaders? So those are the 2 parts of our conversation. Please do put your comments in the chat and your questions in the chat. I'll do my best to pick them up if we have time to. But look, without further ado, let's move to our panel, because I want to give them as much time as I possibly can this afternoon. So as I say, we're going to start with the first question about curriculum, and in light of our current context, how do we amplify the voices of our next generation, particularly those who might be more disadvantaged or underserved? How do we amplify their voices in shaping and leading that curriculum? And I'm going to come to Erica first. Erica.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Susan. So great to be here with such inspiring speakers and all of you of the audience. So to share my initial thoughts, I thought I would quickly share with you a story that we've seen that I think illustrates some of the points on the challenge here. And as a quick context, just to explain, our organization, Ensina Brasil, or Teach for Brazil, recruits, selects, and develops young professionals to teach in underserved communities for at least 2 years, aiming to improve opportunities for those children in those regions, and also to develop those professionals, those teachers, as leaders to multiply the impact in the education system. We're very pleased to be partners of Teach for All and Najin, who is just here speaking from Teach for Haiti. So great to be here again. So as I was saying about this story, as part of our initial teachers training, we discuss a lot the importance of establishing connections to children, valuing their dreams, valuing their hopes first, really listening what they wanted to achieve before starting anything else. So based on that, one of our teachers planned this beautiful initial class to discuss student dreams, right? And she heard kids saying that they would like to be soccer stars, something very common in Brazil, that they would like to be doctors, actors, and so on. Until she said, one kid saying that he would like to be like his brother because his brother was in jail and has killed 2 people already. So that's one of the dreams she heard that day, right? But maybe the part of that story that was even more remarkable to me, that I think connects so much to this, is that in the end of that class, one of the students, one of the very shy students for her class, came to her and said, teacher, do you think you could teach me how to dream? So with that, I would start my point saying that I think when we think about curriculum and the change required in the curriculum, we have to obviously consider what children are learning and what they should learn, but we should always remember to closely look at the why. What's the purpose of the curriculum? Because, I mean, from our experience in Brazil, we're working with over 70,000 students in the country in underserved communities. Students will be considering that purpose, that why, very closely on their day by day, even if they're not conscious of that process. And when we discuss this also in underserved communities, this is even more important because there's so many different competing priorities. They're going to be hearing sometimes from their own parents that they should be working instead of studying. So I think there's a big point here in terms of really getting to that why. And it's tricky, like I just shared in this initial story, because sometimes students didn't have the opportunities to discuss what that why means for them, right? So I think that's one part of the discussion on curriculum here. And the second point I would like to make to start is that entering more on the what, on what the curriculum should mean, what should we be teaching. I think more now than ever after the pandemic, we should really need to consider what students are seeing, hearing, living outside the school walls, in their school communities, outside the school communities, because with the pandemic specifically, we know that lots of efforts were done to keep kids learning, even when the schools were closed. But we also know that especially for underprivileged kids, the challenges are going to be so much bigger, and they already are, right? Starting from the lack of access to live in some very toxic environments that became even toxic after the pandemic. So I think that would be my second point to consider here. And I think I already talked too much, so I'm going to stop here and continue later after the panelists share their points as well. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Erica. And I think it really resonates with me that notion of young people really understanding why they're learning something, to give it meaning and relevance to their everyday lives. Absolutely. Thank you for that. Cecilia, should we come to you next?
Yeah, perfect. Hello, how are you, everybody? My name is Cecilia. I'm going to be talking to you around the experience I've had. I'm the founder of Educate Uruguay. It's an NGO that we work to design and innovate while implementing new pedagogies in already 300 rural schools in Uruguay, and also by an MPDL member. I have the privilege to work with Michael Fullen, and we've been implementing the new pedagogies for deep learning here in Uruguay for 400 different schools. What I want to tell you about this is that it's very interesting to me to have worked in different scales. You know, I totally believe that the scale changes the phenomenon. So if you're working only with a group of children or with a school or with a whole system, there are things that vary. But there is one thing that does not, and that is to start by acknowledging people. So when you acknowledge people, and I think that has been specifically important in this COVID, until you didn't acknowledge what people was going on, what the teacher was going on, what the child was going on, and we try to just, you know, deliver the curriculum or stay everybody connected or connect to the Zoom, it's like we got it wrong. From the moment at the NGO that we acknowledged this, and we did it with a writing exercise from that, actually we got it from New Zealand, from the Maori culture, that it was called, and one day the world stopped. And it was a writing exercise, but actually we put in the same line what was relevant for the children and what was important to the teacher. So my first point would be learning must be a personal journey. And when you acknowledge people and you make it personal for the teacher and for the children, then you have a very strong alliance to work with. Another story that I would like to share in this, you know, search that I've been doing worldwide trying to look for answers was Patrick Miller. He's the principal of Canada. He's amazing. He was part of MPDL. And when we tackled the thing about engagement, that actually is so important when we're talking about, you know, the curriculum. And what he asked his teachers was, just finish the sentence, I want the students of my class to be. So very, you know, acknowledging the students. And engagement actually was the most popular word that came from all of the teachers. But what he reflected upon was, if we really honored that engagement by making them be engaged on things we believe in our world, in our curriculum, and only giving them space to act upon our ideas. So what I was lucky enough to be doing podcasts for MPDL, actually talking with different change makers from around the world around, you know, what went right or wrong in these 5 years of MPDL implementation, that actually it integrates more than 1,500 schools in 9 different countries, from New Zealand, Australia, Canada, the US, and actually Europe. And so I did this podcast in Australia, in Golden Coast, that I really love. And what I asked the students actually was this. It's a podcast. It's called Empowering the Students. And now you can see the link we're going to share. But actually, I'm going to put it in the chat so I don't consume too much time. This was basically the elements that came once and again of the students. And what I can say is that even though they were saying it, like this 13-year-olds in Australia, I feel this resonating in every place that I go, even though it's a rural school, or even though it's a conversation that, for example, in the last time it resonated in Africa. So basically the points are, they're asking for choice, they're asking for trust, they're asking for relevance, for purpose, and for guidance. So once again, it comes to the very first thing about acknowledging and actually guiding that personal path. And when I spoke with Mary Corvdale, that she's amazing, also I would like to share my conversation with her. What she's saying is that actually developing the curriculum is easy, but the real work is to tackle what we offer with what they need. And when I'm saying this, I'm not only talking about the teacher and the student, but also the principal and the teacher, also the ones that are doing the policies and the teachers. It has to be a connection. If not, one is asking something that the only consequence of that would be just a shallow response. So I would like to talk more about that in our next question.
Thanks, Cecilia. Thank you. Thank you. That's great. And actually, there's some real strong links there between what you said and what Erica said in terms of just that acknowledgement of voice, isn't there? So Roxy, over to you then, just to hear from you for a few minutes.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. It is so great to connect with folks from all over the world. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Roxy, and I serve as the National Director of High Resolves. And High Resolves is a global education initiative seeking to activate human responsibility, or a sense of responsibility towards one another, to address humanity's intractable challenges. We really believe that we can work together to solve a lot of the challenges we're facing together. And if there's anything that we've learned through this global pandemic, it is about our shared humanity, which Cecilia was speaking to a bit. The fact that we can experience the same emotions at the same time around the world, uncertainty, isolation, and we can be on the mission to solve a very same problem. The fragility and the strength that we can all feel sometimes all on the same day. And sometimes it takes a pandemic for us to see that now, possibly more than ever, there is a crucial need to equip our incredible young people with the knowledge, skills, and dispositions to build a world in which a sense of responsibility towards one another is inherent. Things like how to be community-minded, valuing inclusion and fairness, thinking critically about the world around them, while also respecting one another's opinions, and feeling empathy and willing to help those in need. So I have the amazing opportunity at High Resolves to work towards this vision in both the US and in Mexico through our partnerships with schools, districts, and youth-serving organizations by integrating engaging learning experiences through which we challenge young people to reflect on both themselves and the world around them and how they may want to change or improve both. It's been truly incredible to witness in our work with school leaders across multiple geographies is the resounding agreement that our education experience needs to shift to prioritize 21st century skills, or as Michael Fullen would say, the 6 C's, essentially the skills that the next generation will need to operate in our ever-changing interconnected world. A global pandemic, the fight for racial justice, the climate crisis, these have all put our citizenship skills to the test and will continue to do so. And as educators, we need to ask ourselves, how ready will the next generation be to solve these really pressing challenges? And that doesn't mean devaluing or abandoning mathematics or reading or writing, right? But building a connection from these disciplines to the real world. And not only are school leaders recognizing this shift is needed, but our students are advocating for it. Gen Z, as we know, has access to the world at their fingertips like never before. They know exactly what is going on outside of the classroom walls, and they want to be a part of the local and global conversation. They want their education to feel meaningful. They're also not afraid to speak up more. There's an incredible sense of agency with this group of young people. So we have a choice, I think, whether we want to harness that energy and insight or if we want to try and quell it. And I've seen schools in the US in particular that have tried to limit student voice or make decisions without including them at the table. And that leads to students rallying their peers and getting on social media and advocating for their needs, which is really incredible, right? Things that we want to see, but sometimes can be scary for our school leaders. And so I think it's time, really time for our school leaders to, at a point where they must listen to their students and their needs and consider how to better meet them. But what's really exciting is that there is this incredible opportunity to critically reassess the purpose of education and envision new models. And we have this opportunity to rethink, why we teach what we teach, what we teach, and how we teach it. And thinking ahead to consider the various scenarios of education and the future of work as well, which I think is an important piece. I recently read a report that showed that only about a third of new hires have all the skills required for their current roles, let alone for the future ones. And in key functions like IT and finance and sales, they'll actually require up to 10 new skills within 18 months. So what the study was recommending is that employers look out for potential rather than experience. So that means they're looking for agility, adaptability, resilience, curiosity, creativity. So a rigid academic experience may no longer serve many of our students as they head out into the world and seek employment in the future. What we can't ignore, though, and what has become very clear through the pandemic, is the inequality of the system and the impact that it has on our students and communities. I really need to shout out our teachers and educators around the world right now. There's so much innovation happening on the ground as teachers think and rethink again how they can reach all of their students, or just how they can help their students learn during this time, or just help them get their basic needs met. And I think more people are seeing that the role of educators in schools and the community is essential. But at the end of the day, the unequal access to resources, particularly technology, for students and families, as well as for educators, will limit what they can do. And so we're facing this new normal. I think back to last year when we had that 2-week lockdown, and I feel so naive now thinking that we were going to go back to normal after that 2-week lockdown, like all systems ago. And here we are a year later with many schools still operating virtually or with a hybrid model. And we, I think, need to accept this new reality, and one that is really dependent on technology. And we also must make sure that all children are not left behind because of this. So thank you all so much. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
No, thanks, Roxy. And so let me play back some of the messages that I think that you three have put across so strongly. So we're looking for a curriculum where which is rooted in the experience of our young people, where it's really, really clear why we are learning what we're learning. So it's really pertinent to the lives that our young people are leading. That in order to do that, we need a really strong connection with those young people, because we need to understand their situation, what they need from us, etc. So we need a strong connection, and we need to acknowledge their voice, because if we listen to their voice, which is Roxy's point, actually they really want that voice. They really want to be heard. They really want to make a contribution. And not only can we therefore build a curriculum that is suitable for them, but actually, if we're really clever about this, we can build a curriculum that can contribute to recovery, and it can contribute to reducing inequalities. Great. So those are big things, though, aren't they? And I noticed Ebenezer in the chat is saying, the pandemic has exposed and widened inequalities. So we really want to think about. We don't want to go back to what we've come from. We need to think about innovating in relation to that. And I join you, Roxy, in applauding all of our teachers across the world that have been innovating so incredibly this year. But if we're clear that that's what we want something that's clear on why, we want that strong connection with young people, we want the voice of a young person to be strong so they can contribute to recovery, to reduction in inequalities. What implications does that have then for our system and school leaders? And how do we make sure that that voice that you've really explained, and advocated for, how do we make sure that that voice of the student is heard by those system and school leaders? Who wants to take that one first? Go on, Cecilia.
Filling the classroom. Susan, what I wanted to add is that it's what we want, but also what we need. It's not only a desire. It's something that we need in order to innovate, to tackle change, to really get a harder hold of equity. It's like what we need. I put up an example of that. It's like here in Uruguay, we are the only country in South America that we implemented the 1 laptop per child implementation. That means that every child in Uruguay has 1 laptop, and there is internet connection in every school. So for us, it was a complete different game when COVID arrived, but that's another story. My story with that is that when we started with MPDL here in Uruguay, it represented a transformation in the pedagogy. And one thing I told Michael was, if we want this to happen, we have to involve the children from the very start, because emotion tracks motion. So if the children are emotionally involved in this, that is what makes the teacher believe that there is something here, that it's valuable and it's worth pursuing. So it's not only what we want, but actually it's what we need. It's the energy, it's the purpose, it's the short time gain that we get by going through the hassles of all the innovation. And one thing that also resonated to me was what Erica said about teach me how to dream. I think also teach me how to have a voice. Help me to find my voice. Help me to hold to my voice. Thank you to act upon my voice. And actually that is essential of the curriculum. If they are out of school and they don't know how to do that, if they don't know themselves, I don't care if they didn't know math enough, but if they're out there being a very vulnerable adult. And that is something that, coming back to the innovation I found in the Colina Learning Center, this is in Romania, and I find someone from Romania over there, that it's a complete different project. I eager you to go and look it out, the Colina Learning Center. And what they say is, in this school, we have 2 curriculums. Usually schools have one curriculum for students. But here we have two, one for the children and one for the adults. And I think that's totally it. It's the only limits of education is the limits we have as adults. And if we want something for the children, we need to have them for ourselves first. And with this, I just end my introduction, but I would like you to travel to New Zealand again, to another place. There is this fantastic school called Te Akauki Primary Papamoa, that it's in a 2,000 people place, that it got from underachieving to overachieving with this in mind. And this is, I agree with Jackson when he is saying it's like hold on to your purpose and do a moonshot around that. And it is, they use this quote, know me before you teach me, and lead me to lead my learning. And what they've done, it's pretty amazing, holding to this principle of identity and this acknowledgement of the children, of the teachers, and you have a variety of the ethnicities over there. So that's what I wanted to add.
Cecilia, I think it's very kind of you to take us on a trip around the world when none of us can leave our homes. It's good. It makes me feel globally aware all over again. It's fantastic. Erica, I wondered if you wanted to come back in on that. I'm really interested in, so what changes do we need to see then at leadership level if we're going to create this powerful student voice?
Yeah. First, I love what Cecilia was sharing. So I was just, I'm going to build on that because I think actually just making one first point about leadership in general, I think we need to start with ourselves in this process. I mean, the leaders need to look inside and see what do we need to change to be able to listen, right? Because when you say listen, I mean, we know if you want the kid's voice to come in, first thing you need to do is to listen, but that's not simple. That's not easy to do. So we need to work that on ourselves first. We need to be able to create those spaces, to ask the right questions, and recognize that we're full of bias, right? When we're listening to everyone, especially kids. So I think being aware of those bias is that first and initial step that we, and I think leaders in general in education who are trying to go through this process should do. And once kids share things with us, we should recognize this as a privilege. I think listening is a privilege, right? In general, and for people to be there talking to you, for kids to be there talking to you, it means that they trust you. It means that they think that you're gonna help them to do something about that, right? You're gonna be there for them. So I think we should also be aware of our privilege in that process of just being able to listen, really. So I would start from there, but then I would add that I think one common thing that I would call a mistake that I've seen happening a little bit here is that sometimes we think that the process, even if we're able to take all of those bias and truly listen, we then just think, oh, that's it. Kids are telling us what they want, so done, right? Like that example that I shared, if a kid says, my dream is to be in jail, what you, as a teacher, let's say, should do in that situation, right? You cannot just say this is wrong because that's what that kid knows. That's the stronger example that kid has. So your position here is not to say this is wrong, but your position as an educator is not also to say, oh, great, let's work on that, right? So you cannot operate in either of those directions. So thinking through how you're gonna help, how you're gonna support those kids, and how the curriculum really should not just, there's a sentence that I really like, how the curriculum should not just be a mirror of their realities, but also a window, you know, how as an educator you can expand, open that window and help them to build that sense of possibilities from what you're listening. I think it's a great beginning as we're thinking about leaders and the role that we have on listening and helping kids to expand their opportunities.
Absolutely. And both of you are getting lots and lots of people agreeing with you in the chat here about the importance of self-knowledge as a leader and acknowledging our biases within that and trusting, Rola says, trusting children have something to contribute. So yeah, lots of affirmation in there. Roxy, do come in here.
Yeah, I mean, echoing both what Cecilia and Erica have said, a lot of our work used to be student facing in terms of like the six C's and competencies we're trying to develop. And what we learned is that adults need to learn these things too. Like we're teaching kids about empathy, and you have adults that might even not know what empathy, the definition is, what does it look like, how is it displayed, how am I working at empathy? So I think we've realized that there is this necessary shift to also work with adults on these topics of empathy and bias and justice, and what does that look like, to then effectively be able to coach our students. And I think some of it is also, as an educator, one thing we found is really hard is for educators to not know something or bring in a discussion into the classroom where they might not have the answer. And I think that can be really scary with a lot of teachers being perfectionists and wanting to have the answers, and a student might say something and the teacher will sort of be like, I don't know. And I think that's okay. I think we need to, and I think my internet connection is unstable, so I hope you can still hear me. But
yeah, we can. And we're agreeing with you, yes.
To be okay sometimes knowing that. Okay, cool. Knowing that it's okay to not have all the answers. And I guess one other thing I wanted to share is a little story that I heard from a teacher that I was working with about this idea of students at the table and students being part of the conversation. And she's been a teacher for years and was thinking about leaving the field recently because she was burnt out. She felt like she couldn't teach what she wanted to teach. And then she ended up interviewing at this school. It was a community charter school in Chula Vista, California. And what changed her mind, what brought her back into teaching and what brought her to join this team was that students were in the interview for her interview, and they were able to watch her give a sample lesson, and they were able to give her feedback. And in her mind, that was like so powerful and showed her the culture that she was trying to look for as a teacher. And I think we have to remember that probably majority of teachers are going into teaching because they have a passion for finding the potential of students and cultivating student potential. And what ends up happening is with like all the wrong drivers that Michael Fullen has talked about, I think they end up losing that passion, losing that fire, because they're stuck in sort of the things they have to get done or the testing. And so how can we like reinvigorate our teachers too, to go back to the reason why they started teaching in the first place?
Great, thank you. Ladies, I'm going to put a challenge to you a bit, which is this. So when I was a head teacher, I did, similar to the story Roxy has just told, actually, had children maybe involved in interviews, really tried to connect, as Cecilia was saying, with our young people and make sure they had a voice. And I was challenged by somebody one day who said, why aren't you letting children be children? Why are you giving them too much responsibility? During this time when things have been so challenging for so many people, including children, is there a danger in that? Is there a danger that we might tip too far into this and we don't allow children to just be children and not have that level of responsibility? It's a challenge I put out there. Grab a space if you want to respond to me.
Well, I go first then.
No, go.
I think you tackled into something very, very important, because I had the discussion also with principals. And first of all, there is not one answer to this. And that's the cool thing about innovation. And I think that was the really good thing about COVID, if we were able to embrace crisis as a learning opportunity. If we were very hard to find some kind of solution for a stakeholder that were not the students or the teachers, then it's probably that your system is struggling right now because the answer probably is not there yet. But going to how, I think it's, everybody has different roles in it. And in this, there is it's by design that you can generate an ecosystem for change and an ecosystem of continuous inquiring to make the things better. The possibility that the children, that you embrace their voice as part of the learning process, that it has to be a personal journey, doesn't, it challenges you as a teacher and as a principal much more as a designer, because as they were saying before, you cannot do business as usual every day. It's not a copy-paste job. You cannot use the last year's planification. So you have to design meaningful experience, even in a COVID experience. And this I'm gonna bring on. We were doing at the NGO. The NGO, we work with 300 schools, and the plan that we had for the year was doing a writing project to enhance and accelerate the writing results. So we had this fantastic project, and then the 14th of March, everybody knows what happened. So what we intended to do, we created a lot of tools. See, this was a learning progression one. This was kind of like a method to what you do first and then in writing. We have books for the children. We had all of this. We were so happy. We just wanted to deliver it. We wanted to go to the school and celebrate with everybody. And then it's like, no, things changed. The world stopped. So we started by this other thing, smaller, less ambitious, but much more effective. So our role is to have their voice and to have in our minds and in our culture that this has to mean something for the one that is receiving it. This has to mean that it's the learning, it's not only about the topics, but about the person. And then you have to redesign accordingly. So we were able to do all of this. But first of all, we had to acknowledge that something has changed and that they had to get out what they were feeling right now. You can do that in writing, and then you can move on. So that's what I say. I would say that voice is important, but we are the designers, we are the mentors, we are the ones that are guiding them, but not upon our curriculum, our ideas, and our world. It's just to be humble enough to realize they have a lot to say, and that's why they come after us, to make it better.
Thanks, Cecilia. Erica, you've come off mute. Do add.
Yeah, it's just a quick story because what Cecilia shared inspired me on a story in a microcosmos in the classroom, but I think it resonates a lot. I remember very clearly one of our first teachers in our first cohort saying students need more autonomy. Students need to be protagonists of everything that's happening in the classroom and in the society. That's how things should work. And we said, great, let's see how that goes in the classroom. Let's see how that progresses. As Cecilia was saying, this has to be a journey, right? So let's see how this journey starts. And I remember observing one of his first classrooms, and his dad had this great idea of dividing students into groups that would be self-managed. And they would decide what they would do at that point, and they would even give themselves a name for the group, right? So each group was supposed to have a leader, and that was the only definition he did. The rest was for the students. And when the students voted on the name of the leader, it became very clear what was happening, because it's kind of strong, but the name of the leader was slave. So all the leaders of the groups would be called slaves. And what was going on in that moment as we're reading, thinking about it, was students were seeing that as this is a slave work, that's what we're doing here in this classroom. So it was for me such a clear and powerful example of how what Cecilia was saying, this has to be a journey in the classroom. This has to be progressing. You have to teach kids to be citizens, to be protagonists of their own learning. It doesn't happen from, you have always been teaching them to sit down, quiet and listen. You cannot just click and change that, right? So it needs to be that journey. So.
Completely agree. The notion that citizenship can just be in some way picked up rather than explicitly taught, I think, is absolutely right. You have to give children, as you said right at the beginning, I think Cecilia, or no, Roxy, it was Roxy said, you need the knowledge, you need the skills, you need the the values, and you need to give those young people the experiences in which to develop these characteristics, don't we? Roxy, your internet was a bit unstable, but you're back with us. I'm delighted to see you. Do you want to say something at this point?
Yeah, I mean, just sorry about my technical difficulties. I'm sure
don't worry.
Well, though, I just want to add, yeah, I think there's also an important thing to think about in terms of like student development and young people development, and knowing sort of the science behind that and the science of learning and where they're at, and meeting them where they're at, and also trying to like push them and unlock some further potential, but also knowing where we need to kind of where we need to navigate those lines of like giving too much autonomy and then potentially the students not being ready for it, developmentally ready for it, but then also when we're like holding them back. And it's a really hard line to navigate. I don't have an answer, but I do think we can kind of look at science and research to understand a little bit better about where students are at in the process.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you. And your internet's holding up really well now. So that's great. I think we all know those challenges in these times, don't we? So look, we're coming to the end of our time together. So I'm going to, it goes too quickly, doesn't it? We could have done a whole day on this. But I'm going to ask you to give a policymaker, pick a country. Cecilia, you can pick any country you want because you've been to lots this afternoon. So pick a policymaker, and if you were going to give that policymaker a piece of advice about shaping the curriculum as we come out of COVID particularly, but you know, mindful of the other crises that we mentioned at the beginning, if you're going to give one piece of advice to a policymaker in your country of choice, what would that be?
Okay, so I'm going to pick one that impressed me. The Finnish curriculum just came out. We were all very excited because, you know, well, they were able to turn around their model in 20 years, and now they are a model to watch. And we were all excited and blah, blah, blah. And so in this meeting, this woman that actually was part of the team that wrote the curriculum said, okay, I was part of the Ministry of Education in Finland, and actually I wrote part of the curriculum. And I'm so, oh, wow, so exciting. And she said, but I quit the job because actually writing a curriculum is very easy. What is really difficult is to make that work inside the classrooms. And that's it. That's reality. So we can write our best intentions, but actually education happens in personal interactions. As Mary Coverdale would say, we are in the human industry. We cannot forget that. This is
absolutely
the magic happens in the small rooms. And actually, so my advice to them was like, the curriculum is just, you know, an intention. The action happens in the classroom. So the conversation must go from the system to the cluster of schools, to the schools, to the classroom. If you don't have all that line figured out, how the conversation will go up to the bottom and to the bottom up, pick whatever side. If you want to go down, up, and then up, whatever, then you're not done.
Thank you, that's brilliant. Okay, Roxy, do you want to go next? Do you want to give us your piece of advice for a policymaker of your choice?
So mine was going to be that finding ways to help educators make stronger links between curriculum and the real world and making that a reality for educators. But Cecilia just convinced me that that's not enough, right? Like we can make those connections, but it's actually like, how do we learn from what's happening on the ground, and like educators that are already doing that really well and use that to feed that knowledge and to feed that information. And I do think there is this strong need to allow schools to do more work around the 6 Cs or 21st century skills, whatever you call them, to really build a next generation who's going to solve these complex challenges we're facing, being more equipped to solve those. So if that means changing testing and how we do testing and making it more formative and qualitative and ongoing feedback and support, then that's what it is. But whatever that implication is for policy, that is where I'm going.
Thanks, Roxy. And Erica, last but not least, you have the final word.
All right. I will start saying that I think the main point here would be really to navigate very intentionally this line that we're just discussing in terms of the autonomy and the lines of support that you need to provide to teachers in a curriculum so they can bring the curriculum to life really in a contextualized space and connected to the students, but that they also gain support from the curriculum, from things that can be standardized, right? From things that can be shared across other teachers and that should be contemplated in a curriculum. I think thinking very intentionally about those lines would be a very important one. And if you allow me, a second one that I was thinking might not be super political correct here, but would be, depending on the policy level, on the leader who you're talking, but just be the example of the citizen that we're trying to form, that we're trying to develop. You know, just we see so many times that we just we talk and we talk and we don't do what we're saying that kids should aim to do. So I think that's very important if you're in a leadership position.
And I think that's a brilliant last point. So thank you so much, all three of you, for contributing such, rich conversation this afternoon. I've really enjoyed it. I wish we had longer to talk, but I'm very grateful to you all for joining, and thanks to everybody that has also joined us in the chat and made so many brilliant comments. I'm going to hand back over now to my friend and colleague Asma, who I believe will bring our conference to an end.
Thank you, Susan. Hello once again, everyone. To those of you who have joined us during the session and missed the introduction, my name is Asma Al-Fadala and I'm the Director of Research at WISE. I hope all of you have enjoyed our second session and will leave with valuable insights to inspire and guide you in your respective field. I would like to thank all of our speakers who come from around the world and from each sector of the education community for sharing their insights, experts, and providing us with such rich discussions on the topics. This is our first online convening in the new year, which is based on last year's successful series and subsequent ebook Education Disrupted, Education Reimagined. And just a reminder of what we have covered and focused on in 2020 and what we are trying to achieve today during the morning and the evening session. We started the first event of the series in April 2020, soon after the global shutdown of schools. And in that event, we shared the stories from the front line of COVID-19 education crisis and what the disruption told us about the imbalances in our education systems. Then the title of the second event in June 2020 was From Rapid Responses to Future Preparation. It was held as education systems were reopening and educators were shifting from disruption to recovery. And our event brought a mix of academics, policymakers, researchers to learn about how we can build back better. And our third event in September last year, we made the case for how leadership in education is critical more than ever to improving student outcomes and well-being. And through these events, we didn't merely look at the impact of the pandemic, but we looked at how it helped expose cracks in our systems, how this crisis exposed cracks in our systems, to see what was missing in education as well, and explore what the pandemic means for the future of schooling. And this is also related to the structure of the ebook that we published, that I encourage everyone to look at it, download, it's available on our website. We quickly, after all these events and discussions and publications, started to see how the pandemic presented an opportunity to think about ways to help our children learn better, help educators innovate better, and ultimately build back better both in education and the wider society. This event brings another point of reflection in our aim to help guide the education community through the uncertainty of today and tomorrow. And so I would like to share with you some of my key takeaways from each of the panels today. Of course, I cannot cover all the great discussion, so I will focus on three main themes. The first one related to the system, the second to the leaders, and finally to the youth. Number one, the need to dismantle the current system. I think this is a topic and a theme that we heard it not only in this session, but also earlier in the morning. But what is important that all the speakers and moderators put it really beautifully today is all these concerns and challenges, how these are related to the role of school leadership. So we need to redefine leadership as a collective responsibility towards a greater good. And again, this is also came in the chat section. Number two, teachers thrive when they are given autonomy to lead. The system can provide support, of course, but systems that led leadership opportunities flourish will do best in the future. And finally, a theme I mentioned in my introduction came also in the morning is that it's the time that leadership of the previous era be ceded to this new generation, that the youth are indeed our solution for a redesigned and reimagined education. Again, I want to stress that we owe it to our kids and to our world to reflect on the mistakes of the past and course correct toward a better future. We need to act with urgency as we cannot afford losing more time, which is our most precise currency. And to end, please join me in thanking everyone at WISE and Salzburg Global who helped organize this event. And a special thank you to Simon Breckspear and Tony McKay. And most importantly, thank you, the audience, for joining us from around the world across different time zones. You are the reason why we organize these events. Please continue to spread the word of WISE to your networks, colleagues, and contacts so we can reach more people and continue bring change in education. Thank you and good evening.